As is often the price of fame, the legend of Rodrigo is one marred by tragedy and misfortune. For you see, he was a man endlessly attempting to reckon with the cursed blessing of his own bloodline. A bloodline even more precariously infused with the spicy passion of Latin American dance. At the risk of reinforcing unreliable monolithic stereotypes, Rodrigo's mother was a stereotypically fiery samba dancer, albeit due to less than stereotypical personal reasons, whose roots hailed from the port city of Paranaguá in the southern state of Paraná, Brazil. The divergent emergence of Rodrigo's mother was not lost on those familiar with the long line of patriarchs that preceded her birth. Her great-great-grandfather was the first in her family that was known to have adopted the name Rodrigo. He was a man whose identity was shrouded in mystery before his arrival in Paranaguá, with nothing more than a deliberately tattered new ID and a one-legged rooster that used to hop loyally by his side during his barefoot evening strolls along the shoreline. It is for this reason and the corroborative evidence of rope burn marks around his ankles that the most agreed upon rumor of the time was that Rodrigo, first of his name, had managed to escape Brasilia's most infamous cockfighting mafia ring. While the order of events has always remained unclear, it was hypothesized that Rodrigo and the rooster had formed a forbidden familial bond, which was negatively affecting the business model of the cockfighting ring. To protect their profit margin, the mafia had attempted to execute Rodrigo by tying his ankles to an anchor and throwing him into the river. The rooster, however, had dived to his rescue, pecking unrelentingly at the ropes until they ripped apart and Rodrigo could swim to safety. In turn, Rodrigo had rescued the war-torn rooster from bondage, daringly pulling off a risky covert heist of the cockfighting mafia's coffers before fleeing to the southern coast of Paranaguá, where he could retire peacefully with his foul friend under the new, apt identity of Rodrigo Costa. Of course, the greatest detractors of this rumor controversially question any rooster's ability to swim and peck underwater, let alone a rooster with one leg. Adherents to this theory, however, claim that the truth lies in the many eyes that clearly witnessed the rooster swimming freely in the ocean with Rodrigo, even if the clarity of sight cannot withstand the passage of time. While he was a kind and beloved man within the community, it was clear that Rodrigo needed nothing more than the quiet companionship of his understanding rooster. It was probably for this reason that his romantic relationships were as short-lived as his history. His brief marriage to a woman, who also remains historically ambiguous, yielded one child, who, in an effort to solidify his new identity, Rodrigo named Rodrigo Jr. Rodrigo Jr. unequivocally took after his father, and even as a baby he enjoyed nothing more than gazing silently at the ocean with Rodrigo Costa and the one-legged rooster. It is said that over time, Rodrigo's wife felt so neglected by her own family that she did not even feel any sadness upon leaving them. She just simply walked out the door one morning as Rodrigo Jr., and the one-legged rooster silently enjoyed breakfast, comfortable in the knowledge that they would do just fine without her. And just as it is rumored that she herself had a happy and fulfilling life after this decision, admittedly only rumored because no one ever really talked about her, she was indeed right. The family she left behind did in fact do just fine without her. Until, of course, the one-legged rooster passed away from a remarkably old age that was made even more remarkable given his injury-ravaged past in the cockfighting ring. Rodrigo was never the same after the rooster's passing. In his attempts to console his father, Rodrigo Jr. made the grave error of buying him a puppy. It was a very cute puppy at least, which went some way in temporarily curing Rodrigo's grieving heart. However, no amount of aesthetic talent can ever so flippantly replace true love. And so, unbeknownst to the attractive canine, the puppy was doomed to the undesirable fate of becoming a rebound rooster from the start. As the puppy lost the irresistible glow of youthful innocence that came with aging into a dog, Rodrigo began to resent him. Even with all four of its legs, the dog could only manage an uninspired doggy paddle in the shallows of the ocean. How could such a mediocre, able-bodied creature ever live up to the deep-diving legacy of Rodrigo's beloved rooster? Rodrigo became old and bitter, which only strained his relationship with his son, Rodrigo Jr.,
who was a lover of all living things, whether they were brilliantly handicapped or averagely able-bodied. Their relationship reached its tipping point shortly after Rodrigo Jr.'s 21st birthday, when he came home one day to the horrifying scene of his father trying to force the dog to eat a bowl of corn. Rodrigo, a man well ahead of his time in many respects, was adamant that man's best friend should understand the merits of adopting a vegan lifestyle. When Rodrigo Jr. insisted that their own veganism could not be enforced on canines, the argument took a turn for the worse, which culminated in Rodrigo and Rodrigo Jr. mutually agreeing that Rodrigo Jr. was no son of Rodrigo's, and respectively, Rodrigo was no father of Rodrigo Jr. Both men instantly regretted their words, and for a moment, as awkward silence veiled the room, both of them were overcome with the tranquil nostalgia of staring out at the ocean quietly together alongside the one-legged rooster. And without saying a word, both of them knew that they both wanted nothing more than to return to those days of blissful reticence. The dog, however, misinterpreted the poignancy of this wordless moment and interrupted the silence with a bark. The damage was done. Rodrigo Jr. moved out of his father's home with the dog that very day. Conflicted with resentment, both men clung on to the memory of silence as the last vestige of undying love that they had for each other. Rodrigo Jr. turned to poetry as a means to deal with the guilty torment he lived with for loving his dog, while simultaneously understanding why his father never could.
It is actually, in fact, largely due to this poetry that we have any insight at all into the complex family history that eventually led to the legend of Rodrigo.
Too frightened to write anything down himself that could connect him to his dubious past, Rodrigo, first of his name, struggled to find a creative outlet to deal with his silent emotions. And so, much like his former wife and his alleged cockfighting history before her, Rodrigo's existence faded silently into obscurity, and then finally into nothing more than the whispers of the wind against the waves. Desperate to reconcile, Rodrigo Jr. returned to his father's home one day, only to find that his father was simply not there, and no one seemed to be sure if he ever had been. Consequently, it was Rodrigo Jr.'s heart-wrenching poem, The Whispers of the Wind Against the Waves, that attracted the attention of the woman intent on being his muse. It is claimed that she was obsessed with the idea of somehow being both the cure and the cause of Rodrigo Jr.'s tortured soul. She was convinced that she could provide him with the emotional stability to move on from the unresolved chapter of his father, while simultaneously inspiring the tragically emphatic undertones of his poetry that had captivated the entire city of Paranagua, simply by existing in his life as herself.
Whether she was successful in her pursuits is inconclusive. There is barely any mention or reference to her existence in Rodrigo Jr.'s poetry.
And while The Whispers of the Wind Against the Waves briefly launched Rodrigo Jr. into mild international fame, particularly in the neighboring countries of Bolivia and Paraguay, and somewhat less predictably in Quito, the capital city of the southern region of Tombali, Guinea-Bissau, the peak of his poetic prowess was short-lived, and he never quite reached such heights again. Some claim, mainly a small yet prominent conspiracy theory outlet of the Tombali region, that it was actually the birth of his own son, Rodrigo II, that was responsible for his poetic decline.
Not that the conspiracy theorists of Tombali blamed the child. They simply pointed out that Rodrigo Jr.'s poetry lacked the same emotive turmoil it had before the child's birth. And to be fair, their observation was an astute one.
It was clear to anyone who saw him that the birth of Rodrigo II had brought Rodrigo Jr. a semblance of peace. He had predictably seen the birth of his son as some kind of renaissance of his potentially late father, and so had named him accordingly. An excerpt from the poem, The Lizard Limped and You Returned, shed some light into Rodrigo Jr.'s convictions of resurrection regarding his newborn son.
If the widely agreed upon interpretation of the poem is correct, when Rodrigo II first learned how to crawl, Rodrigo Jr. awoke one morning to find he had disappeared from his crib. As you can imagine, it was the loudest and most vocal episode that anyone in Paranagua had ever noted from the otherwise silent poet.
Riddled with worry and despair, Rodrigo Jr. could be heard wailing the name of his lost son disconsolately in the streets. His eyes were so flooded with tears that he almost missed the blurry figure of his baby boy sitting calmly on the beach, staring out at the ocean. Overcome with the joy and relief, Rodrigo Jr. ran to meet his son on the warm white sand, only to find that Rodrigo II already had a companion by his side. A three-legged iguana, that was contently munching on a slightly sandy mango while the baby lovingly patted its scaly head. Rodrigo Jr.'s muse had never seen him more content. As she repeatedly watched her lover, her son, and the three-legged iguana quietly enjoying mangoes on the beach each morning, she reasoned with herself that she had clearly become a forgotten entity in this tale because she had provided Rodrigo Jr. with Rodrigo II. And so, in a way, she had proved to be the ultimate source of his happiness. This happiness also coincided with a feeling of continual contentment in Rodrigo Jr.'s poetry, which was reflected in a feeling of continual contentment throughout the city. And so, devout and continually committed to her own work, the muse was also content that her work as Rodrigo Jr.'s muse was done and that it was time to take her services elsewhere. She had grown quite fond of the aging dog that had arguably caused Rodrigo Jr.'s relationship with his estranged father, and noticing this, Rodrigo Jr. was happy to grant the aging dog his swan song in the company of an owner that could give him the unconditional love Rodrigo Jr. himself could never provide due to the historical conflict in his own heart. And so, one morning, the muse and the dog quietly left the lives of Rodrigo Jr., Rodrigo II, and the three-legged iguana without a trace, comfortable in the knowledge that the trio would do just fine without them.
And they were right. Up until the pivotal week Rodrigo II spent in Tombali, Guinea-Bissau, in his early 20s.
He had traveled on behalf of his father, who had been invited to attend a fan meeting, but was uncomfortable traveling by sea due to his phobia that the whispers of the wind against the waves were responsible for claiming the voices of fathers before their time. Rodrigo II, however, would often swim in the ocean with his three-legged iguana and had no such worries about the sea, much like his grandfather before him. And since both were convinced at this point that Rodrigo II was the reincarnation of his grandfather Rodrigo, despite Rodrigo Jr.'s fearful reservations, Rodrigo II convinced his father that it would be an honorable homage to his grandfather to make the daring journey to another coastline, just like Rodrigo had once done with his one-legged rooster. The arrival of Rodrigo II in Guinea-Bissau was met with mixed reviews. The majority of fans were delighted to receive the reincarnation of the original Rodrigo Costa, and perceived Rodrigo II's presence, together with his three-legged iguana, as an unprecedented divine representation of three generations. The minority found it difficult to hide their disappointment that they were not in the presence of the great poet himself, but rather the very reason Rodrigo Jr.'s emotionally gut-wrenching, audacious poetry had been placated into a satisfactory series that only seemed to glorify the continual contented acceptance of mundane life. And of course, there was the even smaller faction of conspiracy theorists who believed that given his quest for peace and quiet with his one-legged rooster, even the original Rodrigo Costa would never have made such a treacherous trip across the ocean, and therefore Rodrigo II must not be acting in the name of his most likely dead grandfather, but rather on the biological impulses of his estranged mother, the Muse.
One might think that the people of Tombali, Guinea-Bissau had bigger concerns to contend with, that perhaps breaking the shackles of colonialism in a quest for true freedom and independence would be enough to unite the conflicting voices of a population.
Unfortunately, like its colonial counterparts, the Portuguese Empire was a wily institution and recognized there is no better distraction than largely irrelevant artistic escapism to pacify disgruntled people, especially poetry that had already continually proven to maintain already pacified contentment. The bonus of solidifying the Portuguese language in two countries oceans away from each other was seen as killing two birds with one oblivious poetic stone. So the conspiracy theorists of Tombali devised a cunning plan to catch Rodrigo II eating tofu in public. Only that it wasn't going to be tofu at all, but rather rooster meat.
If there was one fact that was agreed upon by the entire Rodrigo Costa fan club, it was that after Rodrigo Costa saved the one-legged rooster and thus established an unbreakable symbiotic vow with all animals, even with dogs that may or may not have been responsible for destroying the relationship he had with his son, Rodrigo Costas were all strict vegetarians, if not vegans.
Therefore, if Rodrigo II were indeed the heir of his most likely dead grandfather, he would know the difference between tofu and rooster meat, and therefore would not perform a cannibalistic act upon an animal his grandfather had considered to be family. Unfortunately for Rodrigo II, he had never been exposed to tofu on Paranagua, and not wanting to be rude, and assuming that everyone in the Rodrigo Costa fan club was aware of the one fact agreed upon by the entire Rodrigo Costa fan club, Rodrigo II graciously ate the mysterious and foreign tofu for the first time. "Aha!" cried the leader of the conspiracy theorists of Tombali. And although Rodrigo II tried to explain that he didn't expect there to be any meat at the event due to the one fact that was agreed upon by the entire Rodrigo Costa fan club, the damage was done. Not so much because his reputation was tarnished among Rodrigo Costa fans. The majority of fans actually found the actions of the conspiracy theorists of Tombali deceitful. But it did arouse sufficient suspicion, which aroused significant debate, which, to the delight of the colonialists, took the eyes of at least the southern population of Guinea-Bissau further off the ball of independence. However, the greater tragedy for Rodrigo II was that he could not get his mind off of the rooster meat he had just eaten. The truth is, he had loved it. The flavor, the texture, the extra infusion of protein-filled energy that was coursing through his veins. He felt reborn, he felt alive, he felt on the side of the conspiracy theorists of Tombali. He thought back to all the times his mother had not been present at dinner, and his father had explained to him, "You see, Junior, what you have to understand is that, unlike you and me, your mother needs a nightly dose of meat to feel satiated and satisfied. And just because we are men who do not orient ourselves in the same way, that doesn't mean we cannot respect her desires." Rodrigo II had always assumed these words were a euphemism to explain his parents' open marriage, which ostensibly only his mom was partaking in. But now it made sense. His father was very much talking about a very literal desire for meat, and he, Rodrigo II, now shared that same desire. As the conspiracy theorists of Tombali had theorized, it seemed he was more an heir to the Muse than he had ever realized before. Word of Rodrigo II's tofu incident had already reached Rodrigo Jr. by the time Rodrigo II returned to Paranagua. But pure of heart for all things living, especially the reincarnation of his own estranged father, Rodrigo Jr. forgave him instantly. "If anything, this brings us closer," Rodrigo Jr. said. "You have erred, just as I made the mistake to lose your grandfather all those years ago. It means that we are human. It means that we are capable of moving on." But Rodrigo II could not move on. Not without sampling all of the meat that he had been missing out on all of these years. Not without knowing how much of his estranged mother he actually carried with him. So by day, he would spend time on the beach, gazing out at the ocean while his father continually wrote poetry of contentment, and his three-legged iguana ate slightly sandy mangoes. And by night, now an independent man who lived on his own thanks to the residuals from his father's poetry, he would disguise himself in a blonde ponytail wig and a matching thick fake beard fit for a Viking, emerald green contact lenses that altered the sparkle of his eyes, and finally would drape his iguana around his neck before going to work as a male stripper at an underground barbecue strip club. While the money he made from tips was nice, Rodrigo II's real incentive was the all-you-can-eat meat buffet, which, as an employee, he got to sample for free every night. The way he could devour a steak or a stack of ribs right after gyrating his remarkably flexible figure on stage continued to increase his demand amongst women seeking private dances. Desperate housewives and wealthy daytime feminists were all captivated by the exotic alpha male stylings of the stripper only known to them as the Emerald Swede, who was as zestfully ravenous as he was erotically supple, as alluringly commanding on stage as he was desirably quiet off it. A man of passionate action without meaningless words. There wasn't a woman who entered that club who did not desire to be just as submissively tamed and draped around the Emerald Swede version of Rodrigo II as the devoted three-legged iguana that was draped around his neck. Despite the underground fame and fortune, the seemingly countless women who would throw themselves at him each night, and the literally never-ending supply of sumptuous barbecued meats at his disposal, it's not hard to believe that Rodrigo II, the part-time Emerald Swede, was a conflicted man. For the first time in his life, he felt connected to his mother, a woman rumored to have taken her Muse talents far beyond Paranagua, meaning that the only woman who would have truly loved him for, and would have been proud of, his additional Swedish stripper persona, would only ever think of him as a gentle boy from Paranagua who rescued a three-legged iguana. But the only man who already loved him, and was proud of him, for being exactly that gentle boy from Paranagua who had rescued the three-legged iguana, was the exact man whose trust he was betraying. But at the same time, it was arguably because of his bond with this man
that Rodrigo II might not ever see his mother ever again. If only he had never encountered the conspiracy theorists of Tombali, he would have remained blissfully ignorant to the maternal void he had been missing all of his life. A void that could now only be filled by pole dancing his way into the hearts of passion-deprived women, and of course, by barbecue.
Rodrigo Jr. began to suspect that something was wrong. Instead of gazing out at the ocean every morning, Rodrigo II often fell asleep on the beach. He also seemed to have lost his lean figure, and often had stray streaks of blonde hair attached to his face. At first, Rodrigo Jr. suspected that his son had taken a new lover, but wanted to respect his shy son's privacy. But with each passing morning, he noticed the iguana distancing himself further and further away from his son, and this was undoubtedly a cause for concern. "Is everything all right between you and your iguana, my son?"
Rodrigo Jr. asked one morning on the beach.
"I do not wish to cause offense, but it seems like he doesn't want to be seen next to you." Rodrigo II could not bear to lie to his father. He had hoped that their silent bond would have been enough to avoid the subject forever, but the day had finally come. "Father,"
Rodrigo II started.
"what if I'm not who you think I am?" "What do you mean, my son?"
asked Rodrigo Jr.
"I know exactly who you are. You are the beautiful embodiment of your grandfather, a kind and gentle man who was a lover of all living things. I could never be prouder of you." "But what if I'm more than that?"
asked Rodrigo II.
Rodrigo Jr. looked at his son quizzically. "Don't you ever wonder what traits you got from your mother?"
continued Rodrigo II.
"Well, I barely knew your grandmother, but your grandfather told me that she was a fine woman,"
replied Rodrigo Jr.
"She was an excellent interlocutor who could express thoughts your grandfather could barely imagine, and so were easier for him to forget. Whatever gifts I have with words are probably owed to her." "So you wouldn't mind if I was not just a reincarnation of my grandfather? You wouldn't mind if I inherited traits from my mother as well?"
asked Rodrigo II.
"Of course not. Your mother was a fine woman, is a fine woman to this day, I'm sure. Not only did she really believe in me, but without her, I wouldn't have received the greatest gift of all," smiled Rodrigo Jr. as he affectionately brushed his son's cheek. "Father, there's something I need to tell you,"
said Rodrigo II.
Rodrigo Jr. looked on concerned as his son rose from his seated position. The three-legged iguana stopped munching his mango as he watched his owner take 3 steps towards the ocean before stopping in place. "Son?" asked Rodrigo Jr. Rodrigo II sighed deeply and extended his arms outward against the wind from the waves as a tear streamed down his cheek.
"I am the Emerald Swede," he declared, somehow both robustly and broken at the same time.
The three-legged iguana looked back and forth from the seated Rodrigo Jr. to his standing owner, not daring to take another bite of his mango as the waves crashed gently into the sand to fill in the suspended silence.
Rodrigo Jr. started.
I honestly don't know what that means, my son." And in the longest broken silence in Rodrigo Costa history, Rodrigo II told his father everything. About the barbecues, about the women, about the complex battle he was fighting to deal with the duality of his existence, and the quest to understand his true identity without the maternal figure he had barely ever known. "So,"
Rodrigo Jr. started, trying to understand.
"You're not vegetarian?" "I have to find her, Dad,"
Rodrigo II explained.
"You mean to tell me that you eat meat in front of little Iguanito?" Rodrigo Jr. said as he scooped the three-legged iguana in his arms, which tried but failed to snap up its mango seed in time. "No wonder he is distancing himself from you. He's traumatized. He probably fears that he'll be next, eaten by his own master."
The three-legged iguana craned his neck towards his half-finished mango seed,
fearing it would be blown away by the wind. "You said you would understand. You said that we have to respect Mother's carnivorous orientation to fill her body with meat,"
pleaded Rodrigo II.
"Because your mother at least had the decency to be discreet in front of us, in front of the animals we loved. This is not about how much you love to stuff yourself with meat, my son. This is about your lack of consideration, your deceit." "My deceit?" fought back Rodrigo II. By now a crowd had formed to witness the commotion. Never before had 2 Rodrigo Costas been heard so vociferously. What about the deceit of robbing me of a mother just because you needed to convince yourself that I'm the reincarnation of a father you lost because you lacked the courage simply to talk to him? Why is that my burden to bear? You're right,
Rodrigo Jr. replied calmly.
My father would have done anything for his one-legged rooster. You haven't even done as much as to reach out to little Iguanito during this whole ordeal. You haven't even reached for his mango seed. Rodrigo Jr. bent down, picked up the mango seed, and gave it to the desperate three-legged iguana, which placated the reptile instantaneously. You are no father of mine. But I'm still your son,
replied Rodrigo II as he approached his father.
Doesn't that mean anything? With his free hand, Rodrigo Jr. pulled a stray strand of blonde hair from Rodrigo II's beard and watched as it fluttered in the wind. I don't know who you are anymore, replied Rodrigo Jr. softly. I need some time. And with that, he let go of the blonde hair in his fist. Rodrigo II watched as the hair blew further and higher away into the sky, as his father silently left the beach with a three-legged iguana tucked under his arm, gleefully munching its slightly sandy mango seed. Rodrigo II felt rejected, misunderstood, and humiliated in front of the entire town.
Although nothing could replace the love he had built up with his father over the years, the beach argument had shown him that it was a conditional love, and he did not feel the conditions presented were fair.
He returned to his apartment with the sole intention of leaving Paranagua and to rekindle whatever relationship he had with his mother, clearly the only person who would truly understand his transformation into the Emerald Swede. But when he arrived home, he found a basket on his doorstep, and in that basket was a sleeping baby. On top of the newborn child, he found a note. Dear Emerald Swede, I must admit it disappointed me to learn that you are not who I thought you were.
Given the conversation he had just had with his father, these were not the words Rodrigo II needed to read at that moment. But he read on, nevertheless.
Given the infamy of your female conquests, I do not expect you will remember the careless carnal affair we shared on the buffet table of your poorly lit private room. But at the time, I did not regret prioritizing barbecue sauce over contraceptive measures. At first, I thought the morning sickness was my susceptibility to food poisoning, owing to the unhygienic culinary choices that were made that night. So you can imagine my relief when I realized that I would actually be blessed with the legacy of an emerald-eyed blonde miracle, the symbol of a life to be lived passionately, without restrictions or protein deficiencies. Instead, 9 months later, the predisposed love in my heart was tinged with the unfulfilled weight of expectation. Black hair, brown eyes, olive skin, and a set of perturbed midwives who could not explain such unerring silence from an otherwise healthy newborn child.
My life has become a wheel of deceit. Upon a road I am unable to travel much longer, and so at this junction, where I secretly followed you to learn your true identity, you will have to decide how much the path we could have shared together matches the journey you are on. It is clear to me now that you are just as lost as I. The reputation of your family name is so beloved and revered in this town that as a mother, it fills me with comfort to know that I will leave our son to be watched over by the kind of heart that inspires a village. But as a person filled with regret for the pretense of a life she must now leave behind, all I can tell you is that the sage Scandinavian version of yourself roused me from my slumberous facade, and I do not regret being awake. So in good conscience, even in the name of our son, I cannot assume the dangerous risk of telling you who you must be any more than I can reveal to you who I am. But I must leave the fate of our flesh and blood in your hands. Do with this fate what you will. Think less of me, if you must. But please know that while I was disappointed to learn that you were not who I thought you were, just as I will always love our son, I would have loved you still. Wherever the road takes you, please don't let our baby boy know you for only part of who you are. For the love we would have shared, but will never know. Forever yours, the Summer Snow Queen. To this day, historians continue to quibble over the true identity of the Summer Snow Queen, not least because of the coincidental deaths of 3 public figures that occurred within a week of Rodrigo II's acquisition of this letter. Public figures who are said to have all been sighted at the underground barbecue strip club around the given time frame, who all had the means or methods to conceal a potential pregnancy, and who all appeared to be arguably tied to various details within the missive. There was Jordana Pereira, who died a day after the letter was received. She was the wife of Carlos Pereira, leader of Paranagua's most infamous cocaine cartel. While they were not a beloved family per se, their status in the community certainly made them revered. And Jordana's family name would explain why she was so averse to assuming the dangerous risk of revealing her true identity. Not to mention, of course, that the Summer Snow Queen was an apt name for a beachside cocaine tycoon. However, detractors of this theory question how she was planning to explain the birth of her son to her husband, if indeed she was expecting an emerald-eyed blonde baby as she initially implies in the letter. To which adherents to this theory reply that she clearly was not planning to explain anything at all, evidenced by the fact that she orchestrated and arranged the infamous cartel dinner, where, according to the account of the Mexican head chef at the event, Jordana pulled out an AK-47 from her custom-tailored puffy designer dress and gunned down all the cartel members present, including her own husband, before anyone had a chance to taste the Mexican chef's award-winning flan, whose flavors were subsequently ruined by the salinity of all the blood. Jordana herself succumbed to a single bullet wound she endured in the crossfire, leaving a power vacuum that the Mexican head chef later argued incited the period of insecurity that was to befall Paranagua, therefore rendering her heroic actions as strategically flawed. But while all this appears to corroborate her identity as the Summer Snow Queen, desperate to escape a life of crime and deceit, detractors still argue that her family status already afforded her a life to be lived passionately without restrictions and protein deficiencies. But perhaps the biggest argument that historical detractors have is the well-known fact that Jordana was not at all gifted with words, famously describing the beach as drier than the ocean in a magazine feature, before simply adding to the confused journalist interviewing her, "Sand. I'm talking about the sand." These historical detractors therefore argue that the true identity of the Summer Snow Queen was the second woman to lose her life that week, the renowned poet and author, Emília Conceiçao. Emilia's greatest claim to fame was her self-help books that all centered around always looking at the bright side of things. While her unparalleled talent to paint a colorful weather-themed metaphor had her fans lining the streets for her book releases irrespective of the climatic conditions, her critics argued that her motivations did not extend beyond profiting from the misery of others, and that she herself, evidenced by her less than covert visits to the underground barbecue strip club, was secretly miserable. Many of her fans point out, however, that she only descended into misery and started visiting the barbecue strip club after nature took matters into its own hands to, allegedly, expose Emilia's deceitful motives. She had deliberately held an open-field speech during a storm to promote her latest book, Grey Skies Are Still Just Fluffy Clouds, closing by proudly declaring her long-abiding mantra, "Life is not about waiting for the storm to pass. It is about learning to dance in the rain." After which, she was struck down fiercely by lightning. It was not instantly fatal, but she was later diagnosed with more than acute radiation syndrome, and given a little over a year to live, provided she followed a strict diet largely centered around seaweed. Historians argue that this explains why she feared being susceptible to food poisoning after the unhygienic culinary choices made during her barbecue romp with Rodrigo II, as well as the protein deficiency she was likely to have suffered due to her extreme seaweed diet. Factors that all rendered the birth of her son a true miracle. A miracle that finally allowed her to truly find radiant happiness behind her own clouded misery, as she eloquently signed off as the Summer Snow Queen. But none of this explained why Emília, an unapologetic attention addict, was so averse to revealing her true identity. And so further detractors point to the third woman to coincidentally die that week, Kaila Guimarães. Truthfully, Kaila Guimarães was more of a cult hero than a public figure, and so her story, similar to that of Rodrigo's, which we are still only just beginning to unravel, is the stuff of legend. What is agreed upon as fact, however,
is that she had retained a small potbelly as a result of suffering from kwashiorkor as a child, a severe form of malnutrition.
This, therefore, according to some historians, is the reason for the protein deficiency reference in her letter.
No one knows exactly where her poverty-stricken origins began, but in a bid to prevent other children from suffering the same malnutrition she had endured, she quickly earned the reputation of being the Brazilian Robin Hood in her adult years, traveling from city to city, smuggling and hoarding food from feasts and banquets that would have otherwise been wasted and delivering it to poor and hungry children. One of the reasons, it is claimed, that she would have frequented the underground barbecue strip club of Paranaguá. As her potbelly was small enough in her adult years to be concealed by ordinary t-shirts, communities were generally only aware that her smuggling talents had graced their shores at the sound of her pandeiro, a Brazilian tambourine used in samba music, which she would play in a distinct samba rhythm after completing a hefty final heist and moving on to a new town or city.
She would take her hefty heists very seriously,
gathering intel and devising intricate stealthy plans, sometimes over a couple of years, to steal fortunes from gluttonous millionaires.
Enough time to birth the child of a spurious Scandinavian, some would argue.
She incurred many wealthy enemies who placed numerous fruitful bounties on her head, which could have explained the dangerous risk of revealing her identity to Rodrigo II.
However, in the interest of truth, whether her actual death ever really occurred that week is still up for debate.
It is claimed that her pandeiro was heard 2 days after Rodrigo II received the letter, and that a bloody pandeiro was found 3 days after that, partially buried in the soil on the route to Curitiba, the capital of Paraná. Many wealthy men had claimed to be responsible for her demise, but a body was never produced nor seen.
The distinctive sound of her pandeiro rhythm was also never heard leaving a city again, prompting some to believe that she had indeed perished and had likely been dumped in the ocean.
Others are convinced that she merely ditched the pandeiro to get the scent off her back from the bounty hunters who she undoubtedly felt would have been flooding the streets of Paraná's largest city. Indeed, Robin Hood-like heists continued to occur around the country, but no one knows for sure whether it was the original Kaila Guimarães who was still alive, or merely the symbolic idea of her.
To turn our attentions back to the letter in question, detractors of the Kaila theory point out that nothing is truly known of her way with words, and although her vigilante lifestyle is morally debatable, there are no indications that she thought it to be deceitful. How and where would such a reclusive, elusive, nomadic heist aficionado have found a set of perturbed midwives to deliver the baby? And of course, there is no credible explanation as to why she would have ever dubbed herself the Summer Snow Queen. So in effect, her link to the letter is perhaps the weakest of the three. But her connection to samba music is what makes the Kaila Guimarães theory so intriguing, for it was no doubt a musical gift that was shared by her alleged son.
Rodrigo II was understandably overcome with conflicting emotions, trying to contend with the overwhelming, inexplicable, unconditional love he felt immediately upon laying eyes on his newborn son after reading the letter. An eternal supportive love for a mystery woman that was as requited as it was futile. The anxiety of being tuned in to being a good father when he was barely tuned in to his true identity, all against the backdrop of a relationship with his own father that he feared may have been irreparably damaged forevermore. He sat on the stoop of his apartment, cradling his baby in his right forearm, clutching the letter with his left hand, which he read and reread despite the blurred vision of his teary eyes. Wherever the road takes you, please do not let our baby boy know you for only part of who you are. As he tried to process all of this new information and all of his new emotions, the final request from his lost lover and mother of his child rang in his ears like a bad case of stripper onset tinnitus. He kissed his son deeply and lovingly on the forehead, knowing and accepting the hard decision he had to make for both of them. The following morning, upon his return from the beach with the three-legged iguana, Rodrigo Jr. found a baby wrapped tightly in a blanket, wide awake but completely silent, in a basket that had been placed on his sofa. Lying on top of the child were 2 letters, one that appeared stained by the markings of dried tears, and one that was folded in half and addressed to my beloved father, in the unmistakable artistic handwriting of his son. He picked up this letter first, and opened it to find a relatively short message.
if I am ever to earn the right to be his father, and guide him in his path without the burden of walking mine, I must know who I am first. Until then, I leave him in the care of the lover of all things living, only hoping and only asking that if you were to speak to him of me, it will be for him to learn the importance of being truly himself. Exactly in that way I will love and support him forever, even in my absence. Though my intentions no doubt sound selfish, I hope he'll be able to understand that I have only chosen this path because he has given me the courage to become strong enough to return exactly for him. I barely needed the sun to set to know to name him after you, the greatest man I have ever known. As always it will be, I love you still.
Rodrigo Jr. almost did enough to hold back his tears as he read and reread the letter from his son and that from the mystery mother of his grandson, until he looked up to see little Rodrigo III now soundly asleep, wrapping his little arms around the three-legged iguana as much as he could, which had also dozed off for a late morning nap. Apart from the petty conspiracy theorists of Tombali, who felt vindicated in their assertions that Rodrigo II had betrayed the Rodrigo Costa name by being a minion of the Muse all along, there was a general outpouring of support towards Rodrigo Jr. and the rearing of little Rodrigo III through what were indisputably trying times. According to the disgruntled award-winning Mexican flan chef, the power vacuum left by Jordana Pereira's fatal cartel massacre plunged Paranagua into what is now referred to as the Age of Distrust, which was only exacerbated by the lack of positivity previously brought about by the sunny disposition of Emília Conceiçao's self-help books, as decidedly fraudulent as they may have been. Ordinary people were looking around and starting to notice how little they had in relation to the ultra-wealthy of the port town, and with the assumed death of Kaila Guimarães, who in any case had allegedly already completed her hefty Paranaguan heist and moved on to pastures new, there was no symbol of hope to give purpose to the have-nots. These were all conditions poised to prompt a snap into total anarchy, or at the very least a mildly violent revolution. The final, fragile, only thread that was holding the city together was, of course, Rodrigo Jr. After all, it was his serene relationship with his son that had yielded the uninspiring yet universally adored and influential calm poetry that had ultimately rendered Paranagua a pacifist town. The Paranagua community observed Rodrigo Jr. scrupulously, who was understandably on the verge of an emotional and mental breakdown, grappling with his inherent nature to love, his failings as a father, and his duties as a grandfather. And so, partly to pay back the poet who had stabilized the lives of so many with his words, and partly because those very words had simply not conditioned them to act on their primal human instincts of revolution or their gluttonous desires to orchestrate an intricate and dangerous cartel community of their own, the ordinary people of the Paranagua community took it upon themselves to support Rodrigo Jr. and little Rodrigo III in whichever way they could. The fate of the city depended on it. He was their last symbol of hope during the Age of Distrust, and therefore became their purpose for being. And sure enough, as little Rodrigo III continued to grow, so did the trust that had previously been lost at the beginning of the Age of Distrust. During his formative years, with the desperate support of an entire town behind him, Rodrigo III did not even notice that he lacked any biological parental figures in his life. From the age of 2, he would walk freely around Paranagua knowing that he would always find old ladies that would help him cross the streets. In truth, all traffic immediately stopped at the sight of him, meaning that without being cognizant of his good deed, he was actually helping countless old ladies cross the streets on a daily basis. Nobody wanted to be responsible for running over the prodigal son, meaning Paranagua became the safest place in the world to drive, despite a lack of traffic lights and general road rules. Many drivers became so paralyzed from paranoia upon seeing Rodrigo III cross the street that they simply turned off the ignition, left their vehicles, launched their keys as far as they could, and committed to traveling by foot. The abandoned vehicles that littered the streets of Paranagua served as a reliable refuge to the homeless population, who would strip the interior of any unnecessary seats and driving-related materials and convert the vehicles into adequately spacious, immobile mobile homes. Justifiably paranoid about previously homeless people unwittingly disposing of car batteries and other potentially toxic and hazardous materials that would harm Rodrigo III, electricians and car manufacturers alike teamed up with prospective homeowners to rewire the vehicles in a way that would provide electricity to their newly renovated homes. Come nightfall, the immobile mobile homes that lit up the streets of Paranagua were a true sight to behold. A museum was opened that housed the discarded keys of the original mobile vehicles, alongside a Polaroid picture of whoever had found them. This series of events did three pivotal things for the city. 1. There was a substantial economic surge from the combined tourist attractions of the illuminated immobile mobile homes and the Car Key Museum, which suddenly turned the ports of Paranagua into a vacation hotspot. 2. It allowed many otherwise invisible people, from the Polaroid archaeologists to the opportunistic vagabonds, to feel indelibly tied to the history of Paranagua's proudest moment. 3. It affirmed the belief that Rodrigo III was indeed the prodigal son, the chosen one that would deliver Paranagua from its precarious age of distrust to unprecedented prosperity, as long as the community continued to rally behind him. In the midst of all this, Rodrigo Jr. was tirelessly grappling with his second chance at parenthood. On the one hand, he did not want to repeat the mistake of letting the trauma of his past pigeonhole Rodrigo III into becoming something he wasn't. On the other hand, he was wary of letting all this prodigal son talk get to Rodrigo III's head. So by the time Rodrigo III was 4 years old, he had learned to be a cook. Large swathes of the community would routinely deliver food supplies to Rodrigo Jr.'s doorstep, who had failed to write a single word, let alone a single poem, since the departure of Rodrigo II. Everyone knew, especially with the new addition of a grandchild, that he was struggling to make ends meet, and the community could not afford the possibility of losing the prodigal son to malnutrition. And so in desperation to share what they had, despite the one agreed upon fact about the Hodrigo Costa family, before the emergence of the Emerald Swede, some of these food supplies included meat. Rodrigo Jr. saw this as a prime opportunity to firstly teach his grandson about omnivores. While Rodrigo Jr. himself was firm in his vegan stance, he did not want to apply the same pressure on Rodrigo III. As long as Rodrigo III respected the sacrifice made by any previously living thing he consumed by not wasting any of it, Rodrigo Jr. insisted upon the boy that there was nothing wrong with eating meat, and that it even had significant nutritional benefits for some. He also impressed upon his grandson that in the spirit of not wasting all the food that was offered to them, and in the spirit of being gracious instead of gluttonous, it was paramount that they too shared the sustenance that had been shared with them. And so it was that every afternoon, Rodrigo Jr. and Rodrigo III would spend their time in the kitchen. Supervising from a safe distance, Rodrigo Jr. would leave all meals involving meat to his grandson. Owing to the fact that his grandfather had a phobia of reading how to cook animals that had once lived, and the fact that he himself had not quite mastered reading comprehension, Rodrigo III would often improvise the majority of his dishes, using inspired combinations of spices provided to him by his grandfather to mask the flavors of undesirable parts of the animal so as not to waste anything. Early every night, a long line would wind itself through the streets of Paranagua, right up to the front window of Rodrigo Jr.'s humble home, where Jr. and grandson, as the location came to be known, would serve the community healthy portions of whatever feast the duo had cooked up that afternoon. The hungry community of Paranagua would then make their way to the beach and wait, not daring to touch their food until Rodrigo Jr. and Rodrigo III joined them with their own healthy portions of food. In this way, they could see with their own eyes that the prodigal son was indeed being fed sufficiently, and therefore that the overall health of the town endured. Lit up by the illumination of the immobile mobile homes that lined the beach, Rodrigo Jr. would deliver a poetic sermon of gratitude. The people would then form a chain, linking their hands and bowing their heads in a moment of shared silence before they heard the definitive proclamation of the prodigal son. "Now, let's eat!" Rodrigo III would exclaim. And the crowd would all hurrah in celebration as the feast began and music would fill the air, somehow discordantly attuned with the gentle, lazy metronome of the waves. It is said that over the course of these evenings, either due to the fine fettle born from a full, balanced diet,
or perhaps due to a flourishing existential fear of becoming the next experimental meat masterpiece on Rodrigo III's popular menu.
The three-legged iguana regenerated a fourth leg and happily returned himself back to the wild. The portside feasts only added to the tourist economic boom from foreigners who were all too happy to pay a reasonable fee in order to partake in the traditional communal revelation. As less people were plagued with worry about shelter or where they would find their next meal, more people developed minds newly rehabilitated by ideas, dreams, and possibilities.
Paranagua left the Age of Distrust and entered a period of sustained development.
The next couple of decades would see a significant upward trajectory in relation to infrastructure, literacy, and even life expectancy, which in turn continued to figuratively and literally breathe new life into the city. Everywhere they looked, it was clear to the community that they were creating something bigger for themselves because they were collectively investing in something bigger than themselves.
Which is why they simply could not ignore Rodrigo III's Pandeiro prowess.
It was actually exactly during one of these famed portside musical feasts that Rodrigo III, a few weeks shy of his 5th birthday, was handed an old pandeiro from a smiley veteran musician during a particularly fiery samba circle, and promptly proceeded to beat the most distinctively energetic percussive solo of the night. Such a distinctive pandeiro style had not been heard in Paranagua since Kaila Guimarães had allegedly left the town following her hefty heist.
There was not a samba musician in Paranagua who did not want to nurture the young boy's talent.
Again, in an effort to keep his grandson's feet on the ground, Rodrigo Jr. insisted that any pandeiro playing could not overshadow the child's need for a well-rounded education. Luckily, there was no lack of enlightened dreamers emerging in Paranagua, who were all too happy to share their books and tutor Rodrigo III in a quest to also sharpen their own minds.
And so it was that by 7 years of age, Rodrigo III was running his own book club,
exploring the works of the greatest Latin American authors of the time. From the home comforts of Jorge Amado to the heralded tales of one of the original greats in Miguel de Cervantes, there seemed to be few texts that the now bilingual Rodrigo III could not quote.
One would be forgiven for assuming that he was destined to take up the writing mantle of his locally famous grandfather,
if he wasn't transforming himself into a master chef by sunset and a rhythmic virtuoso by nightfall. In the end, it turned out to be the booming, unremitting tourism in Paranagua that decisively shaped the road of little Rodrigo III's beckoning future.
The three siblings Madalossos were as entrepreneurial and inquisitive as they were ambitiously bound to their heritage.
They were children of a substantial line of Italian immigrants who had mostly settled in the Santa Felicidade neighborhood of Curitiba, the capital of the state of Paraná, since the late 1870s. Equally enthralled by the efflorescent touristic appeal of Paranagua, the siblings Madalosso had embarked on a road trip to the portside town, determined that it would ignite within them the passion and inspiration to create a comparable, lasting landmark for their own community once they returned to Santa Felicidade. On their first road trip to Paranagua, they arrived in the evening and saw the line of merry people carrying all sorts of plates and cutlery that led to junior and grandson's window. The siblings Madalosso looked at each other and nodded, as if telepathically agreeing that they had all instantly figured out the gastronomic magnetism that had attracted so many to Paranagua in recent times. They turned their car around and immediately drove back to Curitiba, where they opened the Restaurante Madalosso, an all-you-can-eat style restaurant that focused on family-style Italian cuisine. But while they frequently retained their repeat customers, attracting new customers was proving to be a problem.
Unfortunately for the Madalossos, Italians were late to the European immigrant party and a cuisine hierarchy had already been well established.
The Curitiban palate had already accustomed itself to such classics as Polish golubki, which was a decidedly palatable transition from German sauerkraut, which, in typically precise German fashion, was a calculated addendum to the precedent set by caldo verde soup, brought of course by the original European influences in Brazil, the Portuguese.
In other words, over the course of several generations, the popularity of these three dishes meant that the Curitiban palate had been resolutely pacified by cabbage, and to suddenly introduce rich ravioli, cheesy lasagna, and flavorful gnocchi would be to shift the status quo in a drastic manner that Curitiban taste buds simply were not ready for.
Not after they had only just become accustomed to the flavor colonialism and immigration had stripped from them. The piquancy of their superior delicacies was clearly not going to be enough for the siblings Madalosso.
They needed something to awaken the spirit, the dormant Brazilian roots of their community, if they harbored any hope of solving their cabbage conundrum.
And so, the siblings Madalosso returned to Paranaguá to observe what else was bringing this unique community together beyond the food. They paid the reasonable fee to partake in the meal. They linked hands with the community and marveled at the illuminated immobile mobile homes that lit up the beach as Rodrigo Jr. delivered his sermon. But most of all, they found themselves swept away by the flavor of the feast that was inexplicably yet immeasurably enhanced by the samba rhythms led by the energetic and distinct style of the little pandeiro prodigy. The siblings Madalosso spent 3 days learning and absorbing everything they could about Rodrigo III's impact on Paranaguá. He was clearly the one.
The third time the siblings Madalosso returned to Paranaguá, it was in a convoy.
Each of them was driving their very own tour bus, which they each parked in the town square.
Naturally, assuming the arrival of some kind of international musical celebrity.
Virtually the entire community of Paranaguá arrived at the square to inspect the commotion. With all eyes on them, the siblings Madalosso extended their right arms in the air, revealing the 3 keys of the 3 tour buses. They turned away from the crowd to avoid any injury mishaps and launched the keys as far away as they could. It is clear to us, as I am sure it is clear to all of you, that your exponential expansion can no longer be limited to these ports,
declared Carlos Madalosso as he once more addressed the crowd.
So if it appeases you, we would be honored to facilitate your infectious influence all the way to the capital of our beautiful state,
continued Severino Madalosso.
But most importantly, just as we offer your community these immobile mobile homes, regardless of your choice, to protect, shelter, and nurture any among you who needs them, we are humbly offering our home to the pandeiro prodigy and his grandfather, if they wish it to be so.
Flora Madalosso finished.
An awkward, hushed silence lingered in the Paranaguá air. But who's going to make bull testicles taste like a chocolate soufflé, though? Finally asked a voice from the crowd.
Indeed, despite their extensive research during their second trip to Paranaguá, the siblings Madalosso had been unaware of the extent of Rodrigo III's creative culinary expertise.
They themselves had always just assumed that they were somehow consuming an authentic, rich French dessert in the heart of a globally unknown Brazilian town, and not the sweetly seasoned genitalia of a deceased bovine male. Rodrigo Jr., however, had noticed that his 8-year-old grandson was becoming weary from the weight of carrying an entire town. While I do not mind visiting our state's great capital on occasion, I have no intention of abandoning the sea for the city, said Rodrigo Jr. to rapturous applause. But if we have really traded our age of distrust for a period of sustained development, then I trust you all can see that it is not sustainable for me and my grandson to feed our growing population on our own.
Now an accomplished orator himself, Rodrigo III picked up on his grandfather's message and continued.
But equally I trust that we can teach and you can learn, and together we will fuel the fire on this new trail that we blaze, Rodrigo III concluded.
And so it was that Paranaguá transitioned from its period of sustained development into its era of earthly expansion.
Over the course of the next month, Rodrigo Jr. and Rodrigo III offered cooking classes in the town square from Monday to Thursday for anyone in the community who wanted to attend. And as staunch disciples of the pandeiro prodigy, naturally, virtually everyone was there. On Friday morning, the siblings Madalosso would pick up Rodrigo Jr., Rodrigo III, and a rolling group of veteran samba players and drive them back to Santa Felicidade, where little Rodrigo III would stand outside the Restaurante Madalosso and lead the samba troupe by fervently playing his iconic Little Pandeiro. At first, many Curitibanos were drawn to Rodrigo III's distinctive rhythm, thinking it represented the resurrection of Kaila Guimarães. But once they discovered the truth behind the pandeiro prodigy, to deny their feet the reckless abandon of dance was simply inconceivable. Somehow, as the spirit of samba lulled them into a trance-like submission, they hardly noticed the sample bowls of delectable Italian carbs that were being placed in their palms by Rodrigo Jr. and the siblings Madalossos. And just like that, the people of Curitiba were awakened from their cabbage-induced coma into an untrodden world imbued with the rich Italian flavor. They found themselves addicted to ravioli, obsessed with lasagna, hooked by gnocchi, and there was simply no turning back.
It was a truly mutually symbiotic relationship.
On Fridays and Saturdays, Rodrigo III, supervised by his grandfather and backed up by his band, would use his pandeiro to entice the tipping public for lunch at the Restaurante Madalosso, until, after only a short while, the restaurant was full, and they would let their samba rhythms be substituted by the overwhelming cacophony of satisfied customer conversation. Rodrigo III and co. would then enjoy a late Italian family-style lunch at the restaurant, take a well-deserved siesta, and then ramp up the samba call to pasta once more, come dinner time. On Sundays, if Rodrigo III wanted to,
which, due to his love for the pandeiro, he always did,
the band would play a farewell set to the Curitiba public for brunch, before being driven back to Paranaguá by one of the siblings Madalosso, where they lazed on the beach, undisturbed by anyone, before the upcoming week of book clubs, cooking, and pandeiro playing was to commence once more. More and more people from around the country started traveling to Curitiba to catch even a glimpse of the pandeiro prodigy, before they were invariably and seemingly involuntarily entranced by the samba sounds that captured their feet and the Italian cuisine that tantalized their taste buds. By the time these local tourists were getting acclimatized to their entrancement, the pandeiro prodigy's weekend residency was over, and he would return to Paranaguá. Feeling a sense of withdrawal, and with their interest around the influential power of this little boy now peaked, the local tourists would often extend their vacation and also travel down to the hidden portside gem with its streets decorated in incandescent immobile mobile homes and its exceptional range of rich cuisine that even somehow included conclusively authentic chocolate soufflés. And given the abounding influence of immigration in Curitiba, it was not long before non-local tourists surrendered themselves to the same irresistible fate. By the time he was a teenager, Rodrigo III was making more money in tips than he could ever hope to spend on his own, and given the love and humility bestowed upon him by his grandfather, he naturally could only think of investing about half of his earnings into the community, who had all feared that the boy's adolescence would naturally lead to the selfish, destructive hormone imbalance that would ultimately signal the end of the era of earthly expansion. As Rodrigo III's adolescence came to a close, without even a hint of teenage angst and apathy, the community of Paranaguá realized that by inexorably following this unflappably exceptional boy, they had been defying their own expectations of humanity.
And thus began the contemplative epoch of abundant equilibrium.
Now a young adult and a veteran virtuoso in his own right, Rodrigo III was wedded to the passion of music more than ever. No longer needing the supervision of his grandfather, he wished to extend the length of his residencies in Santa Felicidade, performing at the Restaurante Madalosso. The community of Paranaguá was more than welcoming of this transition.
However, unbeknownst to Rodrigo III, whereas the community had always supported Rodrigo III's life moves due to their correlation with the prosperity that would befall the city,
this time, the community were collectively suffering from the monotonous fatigue brought about by abundance, but felt ashamed of displaying their lack of motivation in the presence of the ever-present prodigal son.
They had no intention of lulling back to the Age of Distrust in Rodrigo III's absence, but they also felt they needed space to find themselves in the midst of all this abundant equilibrium.
Knowing full well that Rodrigo III was too trustworthy, consistent, and loyal to ever shirk his responsibilities to Paranaguá, despite the distance.
And sure enough, he did not.
By now, the Restaurante Madalosso was feeding literally thousands of diners at a time in its 10 dining rooms, meaning that Rodrigo III, who was now spending all of his weekdays in Curitiba and visiting Paranaguá only on the weekends, was really raking it in. And the more money he would invest in his community when he'd return home over the weekends, the more time the community had to contemplate the meaning of their own existence during the week. And the more time the community spent reckoning with their own humanity, the more they realized they did not like what they found out about themselves.
And the more they began to find questions of uncertainty creeping into their daily lives.
How exactly did the pandeiro prodigy find the motivation to relentlessly keep going, even when he could literally afford to take a break? If having high literacy rates, economic stability, and globally enviable access to above-average nutrition and shelter,
all while living alongside the warmth of white sand beaches and the peace of the ocean,
was not enough to simply be content, when would it ever be enough? How many other ages, periods, eras, or epochs could they possibly pass through? How possible was it to pass through them without the Pandeiro prodigy? What exactly about him was so special anyway? If any of them had had an entire community supporting them from birth, any of them would have grown to be the Pandeiro prodigy themselves. Where was the equality in that exactly? And speaking of equality, why were so many of them so happy and willing to live in immobile mobile homes when they could so easily mobilize those homes to also travel the world as much as the Pandeiro prodigy? What exactly about Curitiba was so much better than Paranaguá that he was now spending most of his week there? And why exactly was he keeping them in what was actually the objectively dim light of their immobile mobile homes, now that they came to think about it? After all, if he could mask a bull testicle to taste like a chocolate souffle, what couldn't he mask from them? But given their meteoric rise as disciples of Rodrigo III, the Paranaguá community did not let their worries get any louder than a whisper, and certainly did not dare to express their concerns to the innocently oblivious Rodrigo III, nor to his equally innocent and oblivious grandfather. And so, while the Paranaguá community was silently falling deeper into an existential crisis, a blissfully unaware Rodrigo III just so happened to be falling in love. Her name was María Lucía, a flamenco dancer from Andalucía, Spain. From the moment he laid eyes on her, Rodrigo III was captivated by the only first-time customer to the restaurante Madalosso, who seemed to make the conscious decision to reject the customary sample of lasagna that was offered to her during her experience of samba entrancement. She did this not to cause any offense or for any dietary considerations. She would in fact go on to order 2 lasagnas later that night. But rather, she rejected the initial lasagna sample because she had not been entranced by samba at all. She had been inspired. Those who were in attendance that evening would tell you that the waves of samba and spaghetti-induced inebriation that had overwhelmingly inundated them were inexplicably unprecedented. Unaware that their memory-defying entrancement was the result of the electric synergy between Rodrigo III and María Lucía from Andalucía. Their deep brown eyes locked with each other the moment she stepped out from the crowd, front and center. Her supple bare feet, as paradoxically polished as they were untamed, were seemingly unfazed by the hard, uneven surface of the cobblestone-paved dance floor. The first kick of her foot demonstrated an unerring, graceful restraint behind a passionate, reckless abandon in response to Rodrigo's strike of his pandeiro. María Lucía returned Rodrigo III's smirk with a flirtatious grin, and the musical joust began. With each increasingly fervent strike of Rodrigo's pandeiro, María Lucía would respond with the unabashed footwork of her flamenco heritage, bouncing the tips of her toes and the base of her heels intricately off the surface, as if the firm, rocky road was as padded and pliable as a sponge. Her long, straight brown hair appeared to be aesthetically torn between whirling to the elegant movements of her body or clinging onto the beads of sweat that began to trickle all over her tanned skin. Skin, which apart from a red bandeau across her breast and a matching flower patterned sarong tied around her waist, colors which accentuated her striking matching lipstick, was almost completely bare. Almost in a daze, Rodrigo III found himself moving alongside her on the dance floor as the tempo of his pandeiro reached its peak, as if they were irresistibly drawn to each other through a mutual musical magnetism, a samba flamenco fusion that complemented itself as much as it challenged itself to continue pressing forward. María Lucía draped her delicate arms over his shoulders and around his neck as Rodrigo III raised and rattled his pandeiro above their heads, and they swayed to the rhythm of the music. And, according to Rodrigo III's band members that night, as soon as the veteran surdo player thunderously beat his deep drum twice to signal the climactic ending, everyone awakened from their samba spaghetti trance to find that Rodrigo III had disappeared. So entranced they all had been that they hadn't even noticed María Lucía's presence at all. At first, they suspected a sinister plot to kidnap Rodrigo III, most likely from the Polish or German communities, who had probably been desperate to bring back the glory days of cabbage-based cuisine to Curitiba. But once it became clear that the Poles and Germans were all fans of the Restaurante Madalosso, and were actually all accounted for, already on their second helpings of ravioli that night in fact, it dawned on the community that they had all just experienced something far more transcendental and spiritual. the last climactic performance of the Pandeiro prodigy.
A soul-defying swan song to signify the completion of all his glorious wonders, before he was called back to whichever celestial plane he had originally hailed from.
A vigil was held outside the Restaurante Madalosso that night. Thousands of people lined the streets and ordained the restaurant's grounds with candles.
Unsure whether Rodrigo III had truly been some kind of deity, and therefore unsure whether or not it would be considered blasphemous to pray to him,
the people present that night decided to share a respectfully silent Italian family-style feast together in honor of the sense of community the Pandeiro prodigy had bestowed upon them. About 2 hours later, their silence was interrupted by the sound of approaching laughter. The community all stopped their meals and turned to see the Pandeiro prodigy emerge from the darkness with a mysterious, beautiful brown-haired woman dressed in a red bandeau and a matching flowered pattern sarong on his arm. "A candlelight picnic!" exclaimed Rodrigo III. "What a wonderful idea, my friends!" And not a bad way to replace all those calories, María Lucía playfully winked at Rodrigo III. And while the community of Curitiba silently contemplated the ramifications of their prodigal son's romantic life,
in lieu of his originally assumed return to his celestial plane,
María Lucía ordered 2 lasagnas, and the star-crossed lovers ate and laughed all night long.
In the throes of their honeymoon phase, Rodrigo III learned virtually all there was to know about María Lucía from Andalucía.
How she came from a family of flamenco dancers. How she had been dancing flamenco ever since she could walk, just like her mother before her and her mother before that. How members of her family would always marry within the Andalusian flamenco community to preserve the genetically transferred spirit of Andalusian flamenco. How she used to have a side gig as a waitress at a Spanish restaurant as a teenager, unbeknownst to her one-dimensional parents. How she had learned about Curitiba from a pair of disgruntled Brazilian-Polish tourists who claimed that gazpacho was just a cheap knockoff of caldo verde. How the disgruntled tourists had asserted that they had been awakened to the intoxicating flavors of the world by the Pandeiro prodigy and hadn't traveled oceans just to be reminded of their boring, cabbage-based upbringing. How María Lucía related to the tourist's desire to escape a tedious, one-dimensional upbringing, and how she had known it was her destiny to find Rodrigo III ever since that clockwork chance encounter. How she had spent years secretly saving money she made from waitressing. How her family had instantly tried to set her up with an obnoxious Andalusian flamenco dancer, a boy so insufferable that she couldn't even get his name out of her mouth as soon as she was 18. How her family continued to pressure her to marry into the esteemed family of the obnoxious flamenco boy over the next 2 years. How this pressure finally made her family pay enough attention to her to realize that she had been working part-time as a waitress. How they scolded her for not only deceiving them, but for daring to pursue anything that threatened their flamenco roots. How she tried to explain that she still loved flamenco, but she was curious to learn more about what the world had to offer. How they practically disowned her for even having such a thought. How she bought her ticket to Brazil that very night. How she became the first woman in her family to travel overseas alone, leaving her parents with nothing but a note to learn of her departure. How she felt torn between her innate love for her roots and her newfound freedom away from them. How she did not know when or how she was going to be able to return. "I'm sorry for burdening you with all my troubles,"
María Lucía said to Rodrigo III.
"I never even asked you about your parents. Are you close to them? Or did you just raise yourself to become a prodigious legend?" she teased. At first, Rodrigo III chuckled along with María Lucía's playful comment, non-resistant to mirroring her infectious smile. But as he opened his mouth to respond to the question, the twinkle in his eye suddenly faded. "What's wrong, my love?" asked María Lucía. "I don't think I've ever had a genuine thought about my parents before," replied Rodrigo III blankly. "No one has ever asked me."
And perhaps for the first time, Rodrigo III began to contend with his anomalous upbringing in Paranaguá, where the ubiquitous sense of community had superseded the idea of a traditional family.
Where he had never actually gone to school, but rather been educated almost exclusively in book clubs and other similar private forums conducted by other adults. He had never joined the kids playing football in the streets, or partaken in sleepovers where the inquisitive minds of children would have undoubtedly questioned his lack of parental figures. In fact, he had never had any childhood friends.
In fact, while it was clear that he had thousands of people who unreservedly adored him, he was unsure if he had any friends at all.
"I'm sorry," Rodrigo III said as he rose from the mattress on which they were laying and put on his clothes. "I have to go back home." And before María Lucía could even suggest the idea of going with him, Rodrigo III had gone. Seeing as he had left all his belongings behind, María Lucía decided that he was bound to return, and so she resolved to wait. Rodrigo III took the first bus back to Paranagua, visibly pensive to all who tried to greet him, and more jarringly, he wasn't even carrying his pandeiro, from which he was usually inseparable. Something was clearly amiss with their prodigal son, which quickly led fellow passengers to believe that Rodrigo III had finally heard the suspicious whispers that had been permeating about him during the contemplative epoch of abundant equilibrium, which could only mean that they were on the verge of experiencing his wrath for the first time. Expecting the worst and not wishing to tempt this acrimonious fate, the people on the bus almost telepathically decided not to engage him in any kind of cordial conversation and avoided eye contact at all costs. Rodrigo, of course, was so invested with the internal battle of his own thoughts that he didn't even notice the external eerie tension that was traveling back home with him. "My little namesake!" Rodrigo Jr. exclaimed as he saw his grandson approaching his doorstep. "To what do I owe the pleasure of seeing you so much sooner than expected?" "Who are my parents, grandfather? Where did I come from?" asked Rodrigo III in response. A sad acceptance seemed to underline the emerging wrinkles of Rodrigo Jr.'s aging face. "I had started to think this conversation had passed us by," he replied, forcing a smile. "Follow me." And for the first time in his life, Rodrigo III read the letters that had been left behind by his parents. "I tried to find out who she was for a long time, if she was still alive," Rodrigo Jr. said as Rodrigo III read his mother's letter. "But I only ever found a road of rumors that ultimately led to a dead end." Rodrigo III was too preoccupied by his father's letter to notice, let alone appreciate, Rodrigo Jr.'s characteristically poetic turn of phrase. So many people had come to see his pandeiro performances at the Restaurante Madalosso. Many of those people had even crossed oceans to do so. He had fallen in love with a lady who had felt so much that it was her destiny, that she had spent virtually her entire life savings and risked the relationship with her own family to travel half the world by herself just to meet him. And yet, while his father had claimed that Rodrigo III had given him the courage to become strong enough to return, somehow, throughout all this time and all of his achievements that were known countrywide, Rodrigo III had not given his own father enough pride to come and see him. Not even once. "Is there nothing else?" Rodrigo III asked his grandfather. "He never sent you another letter in 21 years? Rodrigo Jr. shook his head. Rodrigo III ran his hand through his hair, down his face, and back again, eventually resting his partially closed fist over his mouth as he reread the only words he knew to be from his father. It was the first time he was dealing with a kind of pain he could not describe. The type of pain he could not just simply heal with a homemade herbal remedy made from the leftover ingredients in his grandfather's kitchen like he was accustomed to. For the first time, he felt contempt. For the first time, he had become acquainted with sadness. Somehow, knowing he is dead would be easier than knowing the man he has become. The man who does not want me. Rodrigo III finally said, "But I have to know." A meeting was called by Junior and grandson, and the entire community of Paranagua gathered at the town square, anxiously awaiting the future forebodings Rodrigo III had in store for them. "This is not easy for me to say," Rodrigo III started, "but due to recent information that has come to my attention, I am afraid I have to abandon you for an indefinite period of time in order to find the answers to these personal questions, which, to be honest, have hurt me deeply in a way that I do not yet know how to deal with." As he said these words, Rodrigo III began to choke up and knew he had to wrap up his speech quickly, lest he would find himself weeping uncontrollably in front of the whole crowd. "It's clear you can continue our great community in my absence, but you can actually trust me when I say, I promise I will be back. So long, my friends." And he made his way through the crowd, which parted to offer him a path, while they watched their prodigal son avert his gaze, bowing his head and covering his face to hide his tears as much as he could. And just like that, he was gone. The people remained in the square an hour longer,
more silently contemplative than they had ever been before.
What had they done? Their whisperings of doubt towards their prodigal son had not only reached him, but had driven him to tears. They had made him question himself on such a deep personal level that he had abandoned them until he could figure out how to deal with it. But then again, what exactly did he mean by deal with it? What was the meaning behind his snide remark that it was clear that they can continue the community in his absence? Did he honestly think that they could not? Without them, he would have been nothing, just a lost child without any parents and only an emotionally deteriorating grandfather to watch over him. They had made him, and now he had the audacity to threaten them, to promise that he would return once he had figured out how to deal with them just because they had some doubts, which quite frankly, they were too ashamed to share because of how much they revered the boy. It's not like he ever asked how they were doing, and the first time he had a chance, instead of talking to them like a man, he just fled at the first sign of adversity. Was this their king? A benevolent leader who ran away at the first sign of hardship? But then again, was there any hardship that he was responsible for? He was the reason that they could even afford to have so much abundant spare time with which to be so contemplative. Before him, there were simply too many external struggles to contend with. And now they had chased him away because what? Because they were too afraid to contend with their own humanity? And they didn't even have the courtesy to share with their benevolent king how they were feeling. A man who had always invested back into the community to make it what it was. He didn't have to do that. He could have taken his prodigious talents as far as he wanted and left them behind, but he never forgot his roots. He even had the courtesy to hold a speech in front of all of them and express how he had felt hurt by their whisperings. He didn't scold them for having such feelings. He just admitted that he was hurt and that he needed time and that he would come back, which, if the evidence of his entire life was anything to go by, he clearly would do. But then again, he had been gradually distancing himself from Paranagua for a long time now. He was more of a Curitiba citizen than anything else, and they had all heard about the foreign girl with whom he had a romantic relationship. A tourist from Spain is what they had heard. She had made the entire Santa Felicidade community feel like charlatans for assuming Rodrigo III was actually some kind of deity that had returned to his celestial plane. But no, he was just a lascivious young man intent on choosing a summer fling with an exotic foreigner over the spiritual well-being of his own people. And now he had the audacity to hide behind his tears instead of owning up to the reality that he had only been thinking with his phallic brain. The nerve of the boy! And so the community of Paranagua continued to vacillate between the distress of their self-disappointment and the defiance of their anger,
which translated into an aimless period of development that was reflective of their mood. A period that was to become known as the tentative cycle of limbo.
Rodrigo III's pursuit of his father was comparatively aimless to the plight of his hometown. As he traveled around the vast expanse of the country for the first time in his life, he found no lack of vestiges of his father. From the favelas of Rio, to the sun-bathed sands of Natal, the metropolis of Sao Paulo, to even the depths of the dense Amazon forest that bordered Manaus, there was no shortage of women who jumped at the chance of meeting the younger and more virile son of the Emerald Swede. Upon setting eyes on Rodrigo III's generic, lanky, olive-skinned features, however, all of these women felt immediately cheated and disappointed, and were therefore reluctant to share any of their private information with this suspicious stranger.
If they had no chance of reliving the incomparable, concupiscent passions that only the rare gem of a green-eyed Scandinavian could provide them.
When Rodrigo III explained that the man they called the Emerald Swede was actually just a man from Paranagua with a wig and contact lenses,
the women were incredulous.
Ha! Next you're going to tell me that he bleached his skin.
One woman scoffed.
Oh, really?
Another woman asked sarcastically.
And I suppose the Swedish meatballs he ate from my navel were just kibe? Are you suggesting I can't recognize common Brazilian meatballs when I see them? Then I suppose the Swedish poetry he whispered in my ear while we made love was all just gibberish, wasn't it?
Asked another irate woman.
Do you speak Swedish? No? Then why are we even having this conversation, you creep? It was futile. Every new encounter, in every new town, just made him respect his father less.
His father, who had apparently bleached his skin and may or may not have memorized erotic Swedish poetry to incorporate into his love-making routine.
The mere sight of meat began to physically make Rodrigo III feel sick, especially when he encountered beachside barbecues where Brazilian meatballs and bare belly buttons were on full display.
How could his own father use and discard flesh so flippantly?
And with this thought, he realized that he too was using these women like wasted foodstuff, like breadcrumbs in the dirt, whose scattered path only harbored hopes of leading to loneliness or rejection. He realized that he too had lost track of so much in an ironic search for identity which had only made him lose track of himself. He realized that he wanted no part in granting his father the strength and courage to find himself, and that he would no longer expend any more of his own strength and courage in the search of such a life of emptiness.
And so, just under a year of traveling later,
Rodrigo III returned to his grandfather's house, only to find María Lucía alone in the kitchen. Her eyes immediately welled up with tears, and she launched herself at Rodrigo III in a warm embrace. "I didn't know where else we could go, but your grandfather promised you would come back, and I knew you would," she sobbed. "What do you mean we?" asked Rodrigo III.
"She is probably referring to my new beach partner," replied Rodrigo Jr.'s voice behind them.
Rodrigo III turned to see his grandfather returning home from his habitual morning at the beach, cradling a baby girl in his arms. Rodrigo III's hand instinctively covered his gaping mouth as he looked at María Lucía, who nodded excitedly, still trying to wipe away the tears from her eyes. "Yes, she surprised me just as much," continued Rodrigo Jr. as he carefully placed a wrapped-up baby in Rodrigo III's arms, who couldn't hold back his tears as he looked upon his baby daughter for the first time. "What's her name?" Rodrigo III asked as he tried to collect himself. "We don't know yet,"
Rodrigo Jr. replied.
"We haven't had to deal with a daughter in the family before. She just appeared out of nowhere."
And so it was that the cycle of Rodrigos, at least momentarily, came to a close.
In the words of her great-grandfather, out of nowhere, Aparecida had been born, and with her birth,
as if relieving the pressure of a precariously inflated balloon, the tentative cycle of limbo burst.
For anyone remotely attached to the Rodrigo Costa lineage, it was like someone had finally flicked the switch.
It was like a reset button had been pressed.
During a grand impromptu wedding at the beach, which featured a typically robust Parananguan feast, Rodrigo III vowed that his wife and daughter were his greatest priority, that he would never allow a day to pass where his family wouldn't know that he was there for them. And despite María Lucía's radiant jubilation, there was no one more elated to hear these words than the entire community of Paranagua, which was there present at the wedding. They now had a perceptible way of humanizing the being they had created and revered as the Pandeiro prodigy. He had paradoxically been promoted from possible deity to patently good man trying to do right by his family, as relatable and fallible as any of them. This allowed them to no longer cower in tentative secrecy, but rather to openly accept agency in their own complicated lives.
To maintain personal growth and improvement without setting untenable standards.
Across the ocean, Aparecida's birth was initially met by predictable skepticism from the conspiracy theorists of Tombali. But when María Lucía became the first woman to remain in the familial picture 2 years after the marriage, even the conspiracy theorists of Tombali had to admit a significant shift in the status quo. They set aside their collection of conspiratorial evidence, painstakingly coming to the consensus that all Rodrigo Costa-related occurrences would henceforth have to be relegated to second place in their list of priorities for the time being.
And reluctantly joined João Vieira's bloodless military coup to overthrow Luís Cabral, who had thrown their young independent nation into political and economic turmoil.
It felt like on an almost universal scale, the natural progression of chaotic human normalcy had resumed.
Over the next decade, Rodrigo III and his family lived a delightfully uneventful life.
Joined by the electric dance fusion talents of his wife, Rodrigo III continued to earn a living from the tips they would receive performing at the Restaurante Madalosso, which continued to serve thousands upon thousands of customers every day. While he still invested the money he could into the community, as he had vowed during his wedding, providing his daughter with a well-supported and healthy life preceded everything else. In a similar way, he made sure that his aging grandfather had the best retirement care available. What he couldn't provide the community in money, he made up for in other ways, volunteering as a teacher of literature and music at various primary school institutions. In an effort to instill the strong values of community in his daughter, he would still often participate in the massive Paranaguan beach feasts, which now tended to only take place on the weekends as the entire community embraced a more manageable family way of life. Due to his acquired aversion to meat, just as his grandfather had done with him, virtually as soon as she could talk, Rodrigo III got an eager Aparecida into the kitchen, and she took up the mantle of handling the meat dishes with her mother, while Rodrigo III tended to the vegetarian menu. Virtually as soon as she could walk, Aparecida exemplified the same rousing talent of her mother's flamenco fusion steps, and soon became the highlight of her family's performances at the Restaurante Madalosso. Life was as rewarding as it was consistently stable, and Rodrigo III had never felt happier. One weekend morning, Rodrigo III woke up before the sun to prepare his grandfather for their habitual walk to the beach. When he entered his grandfather's room, however, his grandfather was not in his bed as Rodrigo III had expected him to be, and neither was the old man's walking stick. Instead, the bed had already been stripped of its sheets and covers, which had been neatly folded and carefully stacked on the middle of the mattress. On top of them rested a short note, which upon reading it, Rodrigo III immediately recognized as a slightly altered ending to his grandfather's most famous poem. I need no longer lay here, listening for a past that can't be saved.
For I have now heard the call, and so I answer, the whispers of the wind against the waves.
With the note still in his hand, Rodrigo III dashed out the front door without the slightest thought of putting on shoes. Lights around the buildings that lined the streets began to turn on one by one as the community became awakened to Rodrigo III's cries for his grandfather as he ran towards the beach. Grandfather! Rodrigo III cried as he scoured the shore, the damp sand sticking to the soles of his bare feet and sneaking in between his toes. Grandfather! But try as he might, there was no trace of Rodrigo Jr.'s body anywhere on the beach. The community of Paranagua, with María, Lucía, and Aparecida at the heart of it, had all crowded around the beach, just in time to see Rodrigo III pick up his grandfather's walking stick, washed up on the shoreline. He gazed out longingly at the ocean as the sun broke over the horizon. Paranagua lived 3 days of mourning, in which, as homage to the lover of all things living, not a sliver of meat was eaten by anyone. Even eggs were taken off the menu. It was during these days that Rodrigo III noticed his wife to be particularly on edge, despite her evidently valiant efforts to be a supportive pillar of strength for her husband. Fearful that his wife's anxiety was a symptom of withdrawal from the sudden and absolute omission of animal products, Rodrigo III offered to secretly fry her an egg on the morning of the 3rd day of mourning. It's not that, my love,
she said, clearly still struggling to articulate her agitation.
It doesn't have to be fried, my dear,
replied Rodrigo III comfortingly.
It can be poached, hard-boiled, any kind of egg you like. No eggs, my love. It's just, tell me, beautiful. You can always tell me anything. María Lucía took a deep breath. It's already been 11 years, she finally managed to say with a wavering voice. I've already been away from home for more than a decade, and I don't want to burden you with this now, with all that you're going through. I mean, I love our life here more than anything, my love. I promise you I have never been happier, and our little Aparecida is doing so well. We've been living in a paradise that I could never have possibly imagined. Rodrigo clasped her hands in his as she tried to gather her emotions once more. I know, my love, I know, he replied. I'm here. Just breathe. María Lucía exhaled once more and composed herself. I'm not even sure if my father is alive, she finally managed to say. I don't know if Aparecida will ever get to meet him. I've sent 11 postcards home without reply, one on each of her birthdays, so I don't even know if they want to meet her, but they are still my family. How can I know where to find them, yet choose to leave things as they are? Can you imagine what your grandfather would have given for that? Rodrigo III nodded his head. If there's a chance it's not too late, then I have to go back, at least for a little while.
María Lucía continued.
And I know I can't ask you and Aparecida to join me, especially not now. I never would. I made a vow.
Rodrigo III interrupted.
Wherever my family needs me, I choose to follow. I will always be there, he finished, using his thumb to wipe the tears falling down his wife's cheeks. But we have a whole life here.
María Lucía protested.
It's not like we can just jump on a plane tomorrow and leave all our responsibilities behind. Nothing is forever, my dear. Not here, not across the ocean.
Rodrigo III reassured her once more.
I think we can be ready in a month. And while the restaurant goers of Santa Felicidade and the larger community of Paranaguá were sad to see him go, similar to the consensus made by the conspiracy theorists of Tombali before them, the spirit-like passing of Rodrigo Jr. only seemed to solidify the acceptance of a cycle that had inevitably reached its natural end.
In truth, many had prophesied that the emergence of Aparecida, the first female to be born into the Costa family, born no less with international blood, would be the natural catalyst to spread the name of Paranaguá and perhaps the broader state of Paraná across a global stage.
And with the prodigious prowess of Aparecida's parents at the helm, many were convinced that the people of Andalucía had no idea what was about to hit them.
And unfortunately, they were right. The significance of the Pandeiru prodigy's arrival on their shores was completely lost on the people of Andalucía.
Despite the thrill of his first plane ride, a first-time thrill he shared with his daughter.
A month on from his grandfather's passing, Rodrigo III was received by the most tepid and uncomfortable welcome he had ever encountered.
The good news for María Lucía was that both her parents were still alive and could not have been happier to see her finally return to their doorstep. Indeed, Fernando and Gloria Santisteban were under no illusions about the ongoing vitality of their daughter. They had magnetized each of her postcards and posted them on the refrigerator, each one strategically placed on top of the previous one to cover up the photographic proof of Rodrigo III and Aparecida's existence. The last postcard of the set, which invariably could not be covered up by another, had been partially concealed by a newspaper column ranking the best types of cured ham. The bad news, therefore, was that they were so overcome with joy from their daughter's unexpected return that they completely forgot about the damning optics of their refrigerator. By the time they realized their faux pas, María Lucía was already in the kitchen, excitedly leading her husband and daughter on a tour of her childhood home, only to find her excitement quickly morph into mortification. "It's not what you think," exclaimed Gloria Santisteban as she frantically tried to rearrange the postcards in a more spacious and complimentary manner. "We were only trying to conceal our own shame for not being involved in such an important part of your daughter's life." "Then how do you explain the first postcard, Mama?" asked an emotionally drained María Lucía. Indeed, Gloria Santisteban's hasty rearrangement of the postcards revealed that the first postcard,
the one that would have featured Aparecida in the arms of her father as a newborn baby,
had not been covered up at all, but rather ripped right down the middle. Although she had never experienced the emotion before,
the precocious pre-adolescent version of Aparecida was more than old enough to understand the sting of rejection.
And she ran from the kitchen before her grandmother had a chance to offer any kind of explanation. Rodrigo III immediately ran after his daughter. María Lucía, after shaking her head disdainfully at her mother, was not far behind. The three of them stayed in a motel that night. After Rodrigo III was finally able to comfort his daughter to sleep, he joined his wife in the adjoining room, who was as profusely apologetic as she was adamant that they should get on the first flight back to Curitiba. With the passing of his grandfather still fresh in the memory, Rodrigo III was less keen on this approach. The entire history of my predecessors has been haunted by family who chose to run away from each other at the first hurdle, who chose estrangement instead of confrontation, and in doing so, only succeeded in losing the deepest parts of themselves.
Rodrigo III started. "If we go back now,
we pass on this legacy to our daughter. We teach her to run. And who knows if we'll still be around when she inevitably learns that this is no way to escape the demons of your past. Is that not the realization that brought you back here, my love?" And so the alternative is to teach her to fight for the approval of those who have tried to erase her very existence? Where exactly is the lesson there? At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Rodrigo and María Lucía thought it strange to receive any kind of housekeeping given the late hour, and they tentatively approached the door together. They opened it to find Gloria Santisteban holding an old, tattered relic of a wallet in her hand, from which she pulled out a picture that had been notably ripped right down the middle. A picture of Rodrigo III blissfully cradling his newborn daughter in his arms. "I have kept her in my pocket everywhere I go," Gloria said softly. Rodrigo III and his family moved back into María Lucía's family home the next morning. However, while Gloria's postcard revelation had gone a long way in mending the initial sting of rejection from the previous day, there was no lack of convoluted family dynamics that had to be navigated by everyone involved. Fernando Santisteban, for example, was decidedly overjoyed at the idea of having his granddaughter in his own home, but equally disgruntled with his daughter's choice of a foreign husband who had thrown his flamenco bloodline into disrepute. For the sake of his love for his granddaughter, and his fear of losing his only daughter for yet another decade, he tried to relate Rodrigo III's humble background of growing up in a third world country to the discriminatory plight of his own gypsy heritage. But in choosing this approach, he found himself finding Rodrigo III's otherwise impressive knowledge of Cervantes and overall superior grasp of Spanish literature and linguistics infuriatingly snobbish. Still, he thought there was hope for their relationship yet, upon learning that Rodrigo III was the most venerated percussionist in the entire state of Paraná, and had supposedly been a formidable accompanist for his daughter's flamenco career across the pond. His internal fury knew no bounds, however, when it became clear that Rodrigo III had not been accompanying his daughter with the thick, resonant anchor of a cajon, but rather the flimsy, dry jingles of a tambourine. There was simply no way such a basic hand drum, nor the musician who played it, could be so glorified by so many. And the more he listened to María Lucía describe the grand feats of her husband, the car batteries that allegedly lit up an entire city, the bull genitalia he passed off as French pastries, the more it became clear to Fernando Santisteban that Rodrigo III was nothing more than a fraud. A con artist whose flawless Spanish skills only proved that he was dangerously committed and well-versed to playing the long game. This man had clearly and shamelessly somehow brainwashed his young, innocent and naive daughter with his outlandish fabrications of reality, even going as far as to impregnate her, all in the name of a deplorable scheme to attain a visa in a first world country. The thought made Fernando Santisteban sick to his stomach, and while he continued to feign amity towards his son-in-law, he secretly made a vow to save his daughter, and thus beat Rodrigo III at his own game. Unaware of his father-in-law's vengeful interpretation of past events, Rodrigo III was intent on leading by example, and sought to capitalize on his many talents to forge a stable and comfortable life for his family in a new country. However, much to the dismay of the prophets of Paranaguá, his Pandeiro prodigy fame did not translate quite as resonantly to an Andalusian audience, who largely had the same scruples towards the instrument as María Lucía's father. And while Rodrigo III's grasp of the Spanish language was indeed impressive, there was no lack of Portuguese speakers, either from neighboring Portugal itself or earlier Brazilian immigrants from bigger cities such as São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, who had at least comparable levels to Rodrigo III in both languages. It was the one time he momentarily regretted not looking like the son of an authentically deceptive Emerald Swede. However, thoughts of his father still largely made him sick, which also negatively impacted his culinary prospects. He could not bring himself to cook the array of fried fish dishes and cured hams that dominated the gastronomical scene. And while he had some success with his niche vegetable creations, the majority of Andalusians felt that cold soup in the form of gazpacho was experimentally satisfying enough. So while Paranaguan fame was misleadingly prophesied to compete with the influence of Hollywood, and the even greater influence of Bollywood, Rodrigo III was able to easily settle into a tight-knit Brazilian community in the area, where he was warmly welcomed as the pandeiro prodigy that he was. Always in tandem with his wife, between freelance samba gigs, language tutoring, and event catering, he was able to afford a modest apartment and carve out the comfortable if unremarkable base from which his family could build a happy life. In fact, on a personal level, he he quite enjoyed the newly acquired contrast of familial living under an umbrella of relative anonymity.
Understandably, the person who struggled with the transition more than anyone else was young Aparecida.
At school, she instantly became the victim of bullying. If it wasn't the absurdity of her father's tambourine playing, then it was the way she spoke. She was actually perhaps the only truly bilingual student in her class, and taking after her father, she had a linguistic level far beyond her years. However, Brazilian Portuguese was her first and most comfortable language, and the distinctive foreign twang in her Spanish accent was the subject of much ridicule. Not to mention that her active community upbringing in Paranagua,
she was, for example, also as well versed in the works of Cervantes as her father,
had also made her mature beyond her years, which meant that she could articulate and manipulate words with the eloquence of a seasoned 30-year-old writer, which only made her the subject of even more ridicule. To top it all off, she was the embodiment of her mother's rebellious samba flamenco dance style. Her long dark brown hair would thrash wildly as she danced, before often ending up chaotically stuck around her sweaty face, earning her the unenviable nickname of the sweaty wild librarian. Her grandmother, Gloria Santisteban, made it her sole mission to instill the traditional values of flamenco into her granddaughter, seizing on the opportunity to provide the antidote to Aparecida's bullying, while also honing in her granddaughter's undeniable, untapped potential. But Aparecida had been raised to embrace her uniqueness, and especially in the midst of all this confined change, her vivaciously wild dance style is what made her feel free and somehow at home. Her grandmother became increasingly frustrated at Aparecida's blatant disregard of her teachings, but each time she tried to explain to her granddaughter that she was only being hard on her to help her, the image of the postcards on the fridge could not help but resurface in Aparecida's mind, and she could not help but interpret her grandmother's help as another attempt at identity erasure.
She was not accepted as herself at school, she was not accepted as herself by members of her own family, and there was only one person to blame.
The woman who was responsible for making them move from the perfect life they had in Paranagua. The woman who had stripped her of her very sense of belonging. Her mother. Although many tried to reassure her otherwise, María Lucía knew that her increasingly fractious relationship with her daughter was owed to more than the angst of pubescent hormones.
While she supported Aparecida's desire to be unique,
it also broke her heart to see her daughter so brutally ostracized for this very uniqueness.
And so she tried to encourage Aparecida to embrace her Andalusian roots in addition to those she carried from Paranagua.
In way of this encouragement, María Lucía attempted to lead by example by also reverting back to her more traditional flamenco style of dancing. From Aparecida's point of view, María Lucía had sided with Gloria Santisteban, which could only mean that her very own mother also now viewed her as a disappointment. Soon the shouting matches between María Lucía and Aparecida turned into the silent treatment. But Rodrigo III could only act as the unwilling intermediary for so long, and the silent treatment turned into a complete lack of communication between mother and daughter.
To Aparecida, her father was the only one who had not compromised who he was.
At the expense of trading his communal stature to one of humble anonymity, he had still stayed true to himself, and he was also clearly happiest whenever he could share in pandeiro flamenco, literary analysis, or experimental cuisine with his daughter. Rodrigo III was the only person Aparecida felt she could trust.
This, of course, made María Lucía feel like her husband was allowing her to be the bad cop in the parental dynamic.
Why can't we just go back to Paranagua now?
She pleaded with her husband one night as they were getting ready for bed.
It's been 2 years. I've reconciled with my parents. Sure, it's not perfect and they are clearly set in their ways, but they are clearly making an effort. Going back home will not mean that I am losing them this time.
Rodrigo III sighed.
I don't think I'm ready to leave, he finally said. You don't think you're ready to leave?
Asked María Lucía incredulously.
And when exactly will you be ready? She began to raise her voice. When our daughter wants to move back only with you, is that when you'll be ready? Unbeknownst to the arguing couple, Aparecida had been alerted to her mother's rising voice and was now listening outside their room, her ear pressed against her parents' bedroom door, curious as to why her decidedly evil mother was yet again castigating her innocent father. I didn't know it was going to be this way when we left,
Rodrigo III tried to explain.
But now that we're here, I don't know what I go back to. A house that reminds me of my vanished grandfather, if not my vanished father before him. A city that will expect me to bring back the refreshing beginning of some kind of new cycle which simply doesn't exist.
María Lucía wanted to empathize with her husband, but she couldn't bring herself to understand his sudden change of heart.
What happened to the importance of confronting the demons of your past?
She softly managed to ask.
But I didn't run away,
Rodrigo III replied.
I moved with you, not realizing that we were leaving nothing behind. María Lucía shook her head. I can't believe you, she finally managed to say, and she switched off the light to go to sleep. On the other side of the door, Aparecida also could not believe what she had heard.
Her mother had struck again.
She had stripped her father of everything he had known and now couldn't believe that she, as his wife, had a duty to stand by his side to build it back up again. It was then that she realized that her father needed her, maybe even more than she needed him. So she resolved to no longer talk back to her bullies at school or to challenge her grandmother at the dance studio. To all who saw and interacted with her in public, including her mother, she was infectiously charming, elegantly poised, and endearingly well-mannered. Her greatest haters even had to reluctantly retract the sweaty wild librarian moniker that they had bestowed upon her, despite the fact that she was still a literary nerd and a rebellious clammy dancer whenever she would perform pandero flamenco with her father. The truth was that in the public eye, she was unassailably likable in virtually every way, which was even more remarkable given that this was during her hormonally precarious teenage years.
María Lucía would have been forgiven for believing that her daughter had finally taken her advice to embrace both of her roots, if Aparecida was not so dismissively cold toward her behind closed doors.
All of this came to a head after Aparecida rejected a red sarong that her mother had gifted her on her 17th birthday. I don't want to be like you,
Aparecida coldly explained to her mother upon confrontation.
No amount of risque cloths you weirdly want to hand down to your teenage daughter will change the fact that you're the reason we had to leave our perfectly good lives behind. María Lucía finally lost her cool. You know what? Fine. I am the reason we moved to Andalucía 6 years ago to reconcile with my parents. Sue me. But you know what? I've wanted to go back to Paranagua for years, so if you want someone to blame, you should be looking no further than your father, because he's the reason we're still here. I know all about that,
replied Aparecida in a matter-of-fact tone.
Just like you, I also can't believe the emptiness he was forced to forget all because he wanted to be here with you. It must be so hard to have someone redefine his whole life to support you without expecting anything in return. I can't imagine how lonely it must feel like to be a victim without a cause. And instinctively, as if her limbs had involuntarily taken it upon themselves to protect her honor, María Lucía slapped her daughter across the face.
No sooner had her palm struck her daughter's cheek than María Lucía felt an electric wave of regret coursing through her body.
But before she could even open her mouth for an apology, Aparecida had dashed into the arms of her father. I think you need to give us some space,
Rodrigo III said calmly.
Caught in a whirlwind of emotions, a teary María Lucía did not know what to say. How could you turn her against me like that?
Was all she could muster.
She grabbed her purse and left her apartment, back to the refuge of her childhood home. Fernando Santisteban was once again all too happy to welcome his distraught daughter back home. He had been biding his time, collecting the evidence that would irrecoverably expose his son-in-law's fraudulent ways.
Evidence that was all tied to the scandalously exposing expose of one José Andrés Martínez,
an old decrepit drug dealer who had recently been captured on his deathbed in the small town of Torreón, and who for decades before his confession was only renowned for being his town's most decorated head chef,
whose specialty was his award-winning Mexican flan. According to José Andrés Martínez's confession, he had always secretly juggled small-town, hallucinogenic-based drug trafficking with his conscience-cleansing Bible studies. And of course, the therapeutic outlet of baking delectable Mexican pastries. But was only introduced to the sinful world of cocaine trafficking outside his hometown after forming a friendship with Jordana Pereira,
who had fallen in love with his spongy caramel flan upon a chance visit to Torreón, and subsequently offered him absurd sums of money to be her husband's head chef in the portside town of Paranagua. It soon became clear to Jose that Jordana had not hired him to be her husband's head chef at all. Jose became Jordana's platonic confidant, as she would often find herself in his kitchen, lamenting the toxic reality of her failing marriage while scoffing down entire plates of sponge cake to eat away her pain. Jose feared that her unhealthy daily sugar intake could only inevitably lead to diabetes, and not wanting to be the reason why the wife of Paranagua's most feared drug lord would have to amputate a foot later down the line, he decided that he had to find Jordana a hobby outside of the house. Not wanting to rouse any unnecessary suspicion, he made sure to hide his intentions in plain sight and took her to a public reading of a famous local poet by the name of Hodrigo Costa Jr. Unfortunately for Jose, Jordana was completely swept off her feet by a man who could express himself with words she could not even imagine existed. And even more unfortunately for Jose, Rodrigo Jr. was a lover of all things living, and even more so towards things that were clearly in need of love. And so it turned out that Jose had in fact compounded his problems as he became the custodian of their affair, secretly sneaking Rodrigo Jr. into his kitchen, where he and Jordana Pereira would often appease each other's need for love. It was a ruse they knew they could not keep up forever, much less so when Jordana became pregnant, adamant that it was simply impossible for the baby to be her husband's. It is then that Jordana began scheming a way to take down her husband's drug empire, plotting to use Rodrigo Jr.'s poetry and Jose Martinez's award-winning flan as the main attractions to lure her husband's gluttonous colleagues for a celebratory dinner. Despite his growing love for Jordana, as the lover of all things living, Rodrigo Jr. had strong reservations about taking over the mantle of Paranagua's most feared drug kingpin, especially when it would mean raising a child into such a violent and murderous life. In her blind devotion to Rodrigo Jr., Jordana promised him that he would not have to play any part in the actual dismantling of the cartel. She also promised that they were acting only as saviors, and once the dismantling was over, they would not continue to use drugs to exploit and profit off of desperate and sick people in Paranagua, despite Jose Martinez's assertions that this would only vacate a dangerous power vacuum that would have to be filled. Rodrigo Jr., however, was equally blindly devoted to Jordana, and even more so by the prospect of becoming a father again, that he too failed to heed Jose's warnings, not wanting to be entangled in this most naive of plans. Despite his newfound affinity to the southern Brazilian seaside, Jose had been secretly plotting to flee directly after the dinner massacre, until, mere days before the grand event, Rodrigo Jr. was plunged into unforeseen emotional turmoil. On the day that Jordana gave birth to a son, the trigger for the celebratory cartel dinner that was to be held, Rodrigo Jr. had a falling out with his identity-bereft son, Rodrigo II. The next morning, Rodrigo Jr. found a baby in a basket in his home and learned that his son had run away, but even more jarringly, that he had left behind his bastard son for Rodrigo Jr. to raise in his absence. Even more jarringly still, based on the contents from the letter signed by the Summer Snow Queen, Rodrigo Jr. could not be sure whether his bastard grandson was actually, in truth, his own bastard son. Could it be that the woman he had been having a loving affair with was also having a loving affair with his son? On the one hand, Rodrigo Jr. knew that the writing in the letter was far beyond Jordana Pereira's way with words. On the other hand, after months of painstaking explanation, Rodrigo Jr. knew that Jordana had finally understood the usage of a metaphor. But was that enough to elevate her elementary linguistic skills so much as to leave such a heart-wrenchingly eloquent letter? The kind of letter that Rodrigo Jr. himself would write? The kind of letter that perhaps even his most linguistically challenged die-hard fan and lover could probably learn to imitate? The following day, as he looked upon Jordana Pereira, who had a crazed smile across her face, her AK-47 brandished in the air as she stood over the buffet of dead bodies strewn across the dining table, he only saw a temerarious woman whose word could not be trusted. A mother of death, when his reputation, and more importantly, his bastard son/grandson, required him to be the lover of all things living. And so intuitively, with one unexpected pull of a trigger, he ensured that Jordana Pereira was living no more. Tormented by the murderous hands he had not known he had possessed, but no longer blinded by the love of his dead mistress,
but rather the well-being of his bastard son/grandson,
Rodrigo Jr. was finally able to listen to José Martínez's sense regarding the power vacuum. Certain that this series of inconceivable events was God answering his prayers and offering him a second chance at redemption and at least a couple more years of seaside bliss, José Martínez convinced Rodrigo Jr. that there was a pious, hallucinogenic way to peddle drugs that did not promote fear and bloodshed, but rather subconscious communal prosperity and tranquility.
But it would require a symbol of hope that the people of Paranagua would conspire to raise together.
A prodigal son upon whom they would place their faith to lead them from the darkness of uncertainty. And so it was that they devised an unprecedented medication plan, initially using José's culinary expertise to drug the Paranaguans with the type of hallucinogens that would make them believe in the fabricated importance of Rodrigo Jr.'s son/grandson. When the son/grandson was old enough, and José Martínez began to suffer from seaside seasickness, he fled back to Torreón, where he managed the supply of experimental spices, while Rodrigo Jr. and his son/grandson took up the mantle of cooking and distributing the goods. After a few tough years of their niche drug trafficking business model, the booming tourism industry in Paranagua eventually began to comfortably finance their drug trade, which was only blessed further by the unforeseen popularity of Rodrigo III's pandeiro playing. The child was admittedly talented, but the dizzyingly drugged-up population unquestionably magnified his talent. As if they had not been blessed enough for their pious peddling innovativeness, the emergence of an unsuspecting family of Italian immigrants took the pandeiro prodigy to Curitiba, and with him, the opportunity to expand their enterprise. Now of an age where he could understand the peaceful community that his righteous, experimental spices could instill, Rodrigo III worked with his grandfather/father to secretly spike the pasta samples that were passed outside the Restaurante Madalosso whenever a crowd would form to witness the pandeiro prodigy's performance. And just like that, their small, covert, family-style drug business went international, and they were raking in the money in the form of tips from pandeiro performances. But an increased demand to attract an international audience in Curitiba meant that they had to cut back on the infusion of drugs in Paranagua, which started to result in visible withdrawal symptoms among the people as they began to doubt the godlike prowess of their pandeiro prodigy. The end was nigh, and it was time to start orchestrating a gradual, long-term exit strategy.
José Martínez and Rodrigo Jr. were in the comfortable age range of knowing that they had lived, and that death was likely not too far away for them, should retirement prove to be a less than viable option.
Rodrigo III would have had the biggest exit strategy predicament had he not fallen in love with a Spanish girl from Andalucía, and as a further blessing, his wife-to-be gave birth to a girl, which was interpreted as a celebratory end to the long Rodrigo Costa cycle in Paranagua. It meant that Rodrigo Jr. and his son/grandson could carefully organize the relocation of Rodrigo Jr. before any potential drug trail could be traced back to them. Rodrigo Jr.'s mysterious disappearance into the horizon would prove to be the ultimate trigger in emotionally manipulating Rodrigo III's wife into wanting to return to her estranged parents in Spain, and the benevolent drug dealers could live out the rest of their days in peaceful anonymity. Fernando Santisteban also presented his daughter with recent articles from Paranagua that featured tourists expressing their anger at being served savory bull testicles for dessert, and other articles that featured citizens complaining that their illuminated immobile mobile homes were much dimmer than they had remembered growing up, and how, it turned out, car batteries were not an effective way of providing electricity to an entire town.
In fact, it became clear that the only reason José Andrés Martínez had snitched on his apparent accomplices
was due to an unpublished Rodrigo Jr. poem, which had been coincidentally unearthed from underneath a recently uprooted immobile mobile home.
The poem was called "There Were Drugs in the Flan." Lying on his deathbed, José Martínez interpreted this as an unforgivably incriminating stab in the back and a blasphemous affront to all the pious labor they had put into Paranagua's development.
But since he did not know where Rodrigo Jr. was, or if he was still alive at all,
he decided to exact his vengeance in the name of his lord. on the son/grandson he knew was in Spain.
So you see, my dear girl,
Fernando Santisteban comforted his disbelieving daughter.
There is nothing you can trust about the story this man told you. But don't you worry. I already have everything in place to take care of this monster. Meanwhile, Rodrigo III was having a much-needed heart-to-heart with his daughter, as he explained everything to her about his family's history of running away from each other, and especially how he had never even known who his father was because of it. So I want you to listen to me, my child.
Rodrigo III continued.
Your mother should never have hit you, but you are not without fault for taking her for granted. Despite all the things you have put her through, despite all of the things that I have selfishly allowed you to put her through, you can always count on her to always be there. I promise you, if you are searching for truth, your mother has always stayed by my side and has saved me in more ways than you could ever know. So I guarantee that she will always do the same for you. So we are going to do better by her. Agreed? And no sooner had Aparecida reciprocated her father's pinky promise than their door was knocked down by Spanish authorities, who arrested Rodrigo III directly in front of her. She did not know it at the time, but that would be the last time she would ever see her father.
There was no due process, no inkling of any kind of legal protocol that had been followed.
Fernando Santisteban, who was already a prominent Andalusian figure due to his family's contributions to flamenco, had aligned himself with Ignacio Rodriguez, another prominent Andalusian figure due to his family's contributions to flamenco.
In an intricate political game of rhythmic sovereignty,
the two men had long conspired to join their family names by marriage, a power move that would solidify their insurmountable hegemony in the southern Iberian dance scene for decades to come, finally ousting the previous dominance held by their mutual rivals, the Cortés family. It was in fact their shared prominence and influence in the southern region of the Iberian Peninsula that saw Rodrigo III deported as quickly as he was detained, his fraudulent name smeared in the press almost as quickly as it was discarded.
As one newspaper column emphatically put it,
the parody of the Pandeiru prodigy will be forever bound and relegated to the poetic myths of his immoral father/grandfather before him.
Nothing more than a drowned-out whisper in the wind against the waves. And with Rodrigo III out of the picture,
Fernando Santisteban and Ignacio Rodriguez began to implicate phase 2 of their plan, their children. Ignacio Rodriguez's son Diego was a widower.
In truth, there were many rumors surrounding the death of his wife, given that hardly anyone had known whether she had ever truly existed. According to the Rodriguez family,
Diego had eloped with his now deceased wife when the two young lovers discovered that she had been diagnosed with a rare incurable disease.
So rare it was that it is still yet to be disclosed to this day. In any case, as is the inclination of all zealously devout children of God,
their keenness to consummate their marriage resulted in a pregnancy that was categorically touted to fail due to Diego's wife's terminal illness. However, she defied all the odds and carried the baby to term. And while she did, however, tragically pass away in childbirth, the birth of their child was seen as nothing short of a divine miracle, and so their newborn son was aptly named Milagro. According to eyewitness accounts from Diego's wife's funeral service, a tightly closed-doors event with respect to the grieving family's privacy, Diego declared that he saw not only his deceased wife's features, but her very soul through the eyes of his little Milagro, and that would forevermore be enough. Hence the reason that the Rodriguez family keeps no pictorial records of Diego's departed lover. Many in the community couldn't help but notice the mildly suspicious plot holes in this particular tale, but no one dared get on the bad side of such a venerable and powerfully influential family. None, of course, except the Rodriguez family's main rivals, the Cortés family, who were adamant that the true version of events was that Diego,
a notoriously obnoxious and socially inept boy in his teenage years,
had lost his virginity to a lady of the night, who was equally notoriously known as the Manhood Baptist due to the initiation services she would provide to desperately undesirable young men.
According to the Cortés family,
Diego had carelessly impregnated the Baptist, who had to be paid off handsomely and subsequently relocated following the birth of Milagro. Rumor has it that she fell in love with one of her clients in the north of Spain, a tourist who happened to be a real Protestant from the small town of Marburg, Germany, where she ultimately settled down and converted to Christianity, and coincidentally, became the town's first ever female Baptist.
Whatever the true case may be, Diego Rodriguez never found love in the form of a woman ever again. Not since he had had his heart stripped out by the transatlantic rejection from the woman of his dreams 18 years prior. That woman was, of course, María Lucía Santisteban.
Fernando Santisteban invited the 3 generations of Rodriguez men for a family dinner, where María Lucía and Aparecida would also be in attendance.
Like Aparecida, Milagro Rodriguez was fast approaching his 18th birthday, and Fernando and Ignacio saw an opportunity to betroth 4 lovebirds with one strategically manipulative engagement stone.
As soon as she laid eyes on the undeveloped, vapid, braggadocious figure of Diego Rodriguez, María Lucía was filled with a nauseous disgust she thought she had done away with 18 years prior. I would rather swim back to my con artist husband,
María Lucía said simply.
Worst case scenario, I'll be eaten by sharks,
she continued before any of the men could interject.
Best case scenario, I'll drown. And she left the room. Aparecida remained. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of pride and solidarity with her mother, who had still referred to her excommunicated father as her husband. Despite what anyone told her,
despite the evidence her grandfather had collected, or the articles and columns that had been written in the Andalusian press,
Aparecida refused to believe any disparaging word said against her father.
How anyone could possibly and instantly believe a story with so many uncorroborated plot holes was well beyond her. But perhaps her father was right about her mother, for despite whatever her mother foolishly chose to believe, she only needed to walk in the dining room for a matter of seconds before conclusively renouncing the suitors that were meant to replace, by her own words, her husband.
And as Aparecida looked at these potential suitors herself, she felt an even stronger affinity towards her mother. Milagro Rodriguez was a revoltingly cringe-worthy mini-version of his father. Both of them stood with their hands on their waists, chests out to highlight their outdated frilly tuxedos. She could see their cheek muscles quivering from the 2 men's inexplicable decision to maintain their forced wide smiles, which exposed their overly bleached teeth, whose glossy sheen was only outmatched by their overly gelled slick black hair. Aparecida was only confident that their attempt at some kind of enticing male bravado was not actually a stroke, when she heard Diego Rodriguez mutter to his son through gritted teeth, "Remember, son, don't break eye contact until she makes the first move." And while she had never been more tempted to run after her mother, enough time had not yet passed for her to forgive the woman who had stabbed her innocent father in the back and cast him out to sea.
Yes, this woman still referred to him as her husband, but all while having the gall of labeling him a con artist after everything he had done for her.
And so, her momentary solidarity with her mother faded, and she sat down at the table across from Milagro Rodriguez, who finally allowed himself to exhale, pulling out an inhaler from his pants pocket to help him catch his worryingly wheezy breath. Aparecida found her mother waiting for her in the living room of their apartment after she returned from the dinner. "I don't want you hanging around that family,"
María Lucía told her daughter.
"Well, you can also have me deported back to Brazil and you won't have to think about it,"
Aparecida replied.
"You know, if that's what you really want, just say the word,"
María Lucía retorted.
"Because as evil as I may be, only one of your parents can teach you how to be a scam artist and a drug lord." Hearing her mother describe her father in such a way fueled Aparecida with a rage that she could not even express with words.
She wanted to hurt her mother just as much.
"Honestly, Mom, you're right,"
she managed to say calmly.
"I would be much better off following your example." Fernando Santisteban opened his front door the next afternoon to find his distressed daughter at the doorstep. "Aparecida is gone,"
María Lucía said.
"I can't find her anywhere." Fernando welcomed his daughter into his home, where she found Ignacio and Diego Rodriguez already in the living room.
It turned out that Milagro Rodriguez had also disappeared.
"Well, would you look at that?"
piped Diego Rodriguez.
One dinner together and our little rascals couldn't keep their hands off each other,
he finished proudly.
Ignacio Rodriguez elbowed his blithering fool of a son in the rib for his inability to read the room. He tilted his head towards María Lucía, who was an emotional wreck after all the recent emotional turmoil in her family life. Diego Rodriguez took his father's cue and stood from his seat, hands on his waist, chest out and hair slicked back to display his macho male bravado once more.
Now was his chance to win over the love that had once escaped him.
Never fear,
he declared sonorously as he looked off into the distance.
I shall find our children and bring them back safe and sound. No, María Lucía pleaded. Please not you. Let's call the police. Nonsense, my pretty little rosebud, he affirmed once more, already at the open door. I'll have them back before you have time for your afternoon siesta. A year later, María Lucía stood hopeless and alone. Her dead, baggy eyes stared vacantly out the window as she absently stirred her lukewarm tea, as had become her morning routine. And then suddenly, in the distance, emerging from the mist of the morning almost like a shadow, María Lucía laid eyes on her estranged daughter for the first time since her disappearance. Behind her, with his hand on her shoulder, was Diego Rodriguez, his chest unflappably out, his other hand on his waist, his disheveled hair somehow still largely slicked back, as if it had been permanently matted in place by globules of residual hair gel. Milagro Rodriguez cut a more timid figure on the other side of Aparecida, who was carrying a tightly wrapped bundle in her arms. Instinctively, María Lucía dropped her tea and rushed outside to meet them, her blurry eyes alive again by a waterfall of joyful tears. Her overwhelming joy was only jolted by surprised confusion once she was close enough to fully process the tightly wrapped bundle in her daughter's arms. His name,
declared Diego Rodriguez as if painting a headline in the air with his palm,
is Rodrigo. Hodrigo, corrected Aparecida exasperatedly. It's pronounced Hodrigo. And thus began the life of the legend of Rodrigo, the man who would leave an indelible mark on the marine life politics of the southeastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula.
The man forever known to the lobster population of Oman as the Sand Sweeper. But that, of course, is another story.